The enemy gave them 10 minutes to surrender, or they would start sending bodies back in pieces. 25 soldiers, 1 mountain pass, 0 air support. Every commander froze. Every veteran reached for his radio. Every man with a weapon pressed tighter against cover and did the math that didn't add up. Except one woman. She wasn't a ranger, wasn't special operations, wasn't even carrying a weapon she was authorized to use. She was the communication specialist nobody remembered hiring, and she was already counting wind speed. If this story moves you, stay until the end. Hit like, hit follow, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Frost Ridge Outpost existed on no tourist map and appeared in no recruiting brochure. It sat at 9,000 feet above sea level in a stretch of mountainous terrain so remote that supply helicopters sometimes turned back due to weather, leaving the garrison to survive on whatever had been stocked the week before. The wind up there didn't blow. It pressed. It leaned against every surface with a kind of slow, patient weight that made new arrivals feel the altitude before they felt anything else. The outpost itself was a collection of hardened structures connected by narrow covered walkways, ringed by concertina wire and observation posts manned in rotating shifts. In winter, the rocks turned the color of iron. In summer, they turned the color of dried blood. Neither season was forgiving. The soldiers stationed at Frost Ridge developed a particular kind of economy, of movement, of words, of everything, because the environment punished excess. Lena Mercer had been at Frost Ridge for 7 months when the convoy assignment came through, and in those 7 months she had managed something that, looking back later, seemed almost deliberate. She had made herself invisible, not in any dramatic sense. She showed up to formations, she pulled her shifts, she maintained the communications equipment with a thoroughness that her supervisor, Sergeant First Class Dale Hooper, noted in her quarterly evaluation as above expectations. She ate in the mess hall at the same corner table, usually alone or with the other 2 signals personnel, a quiet man named Torres and a younger private named Wills, who was still in the phase of military service where he thought everything was temporary. She didn't seek out conversation. She didn't avoid it either. She was simply present, occupying space without demanding anything from that space. The kind of soldier who, when someone was asked to describe her later, made them pause and say something like brown hair, medium height, quiet, good at her job. That was the version of Lena Mercer that existed at Frost Ridge. The other version, the one she had spent 5 years trying to bury, lived in the way her eyes moved across terrain, the way she couldn't sit with her back to a window, the way she automatically noted wind direction every time she stepped outside, a reflex so deeply trained it had become indistinguishable from breathing. Her father had started teaching her when she was 9 years old, not because he wanted a soldier, because he was a competitive long-range shooter who had nobody else to share it with, and Lena had been a quiet, patient child who could sit still in a blind for 3 hours without complaint, while her father explained the relationship between wind, elevation, and the way a bullet began to lose velocity the moment it left the barrel. He talked about it the way some fathers talked about fishing or carpentry, with the ease of someone sharing something he loved, never quite registering how precisely it was being absorbed. By the time Lena was 14, she was shooting groups at 1,000 yards that made grown men at their range club go quiet and check the holes twice. By the time she was 17, her father had stopped coaching her because there was nothing left to coach. He died in a car accident 3 months after her 18th birthday. The kind of death that has no meaning attached to it. Icy road, divided highway, a semi that jackknifed. No enemy. No story. Just physics and bad timing and a phone call that changed everything about the silence she had learned to love. At the funeral, her mother had held both her hands and said, "Promise me you won't carry what he taught you into something dangerous." Her mother was a quiet woman who had spent 20 years worrying about the man she married and was now standing in the rain next to a casket, asking the only thing she had left to ask. Lena had promised. She joined the army anyway, logistics support, communications track, because she needed structure and had always understood systems. She was careful about what she revealed. She never signed up for marksmanship competitions. She qualified with her issued weapon at the minimum acceptable standard every cycle, deliberately pulling her groups wide, never grouping tighter than the range cadre expected from a signal soldier. It was a performance she maintained with the same precision she applied to everything else. Nobody looked at the communications specialist and saw a shooter. That was the point. That was exactly what she had wanted for 5 years. And then the convoy briefing happened. The mission briefing was held at 1900 hours in the operations center, a room that smelled permanently of burned coffee and recycled air. Captain Ren Calloway ran it, a lean, organized officer in his early 30s who had the particular manner of someone who had been competent for so long he had forgotten to be humble about it. He had 2 combat deployments and a Bronze Star, and a way of standing at the front of the room that communicated authority without effort. The convoy would move at 0500 the following morning. 12 vehicles, 25 personnel, a resupply package for Firebase Kesler 34 miles through the mountains. The route ran through Raven Pass, a narrow mountain corridor that cut between 2 ridgelines and shaved 40 minutes off the alternative path that wound around the lower elevation. Calloway ran through it in order: route clearance protocol, radio frequency assignments, medical evacuation procedures. The aerial reconnaissance imagery from the previous 48 hours showed no confirmed threat activity in the corridor. Lena sat in the back row. She was there for the radio assignments. She wasn't expected to contribute anything tactical. Nobody would have thought to ask. She looked at the route overlay on the projected map because it was in front of her, and she was a person who looked at things in front of her. And then something in her stomach shifted. It wasn't a tactical assessment she had to work through. It was immediate. The way you recognize a face before you consciously process who it belongs to. The shape of the terrain around Raven Pass told her something before her mind had assembled the complete argument for why. 2 parallel ridgelines converging above a narrow road. Elevation advantage on both flanks. Choke point approach with limited vehicle maneuver space. A natural depression approximately 200 meters past the pass entrance that would look like cover from the road, but sat in the line of sight from the upper ridge. She had seen this geometry before, not in real life. In every training diagram her father had ever drawn on graph paper at their kitchen table. "That's not a road," he had said once, pointing at a similar topographical map in a book he had pulled from his shelf. "That's a funnel. Any person with patience and elevation owns everyone in it." Lena looked at the pass, looked at the ridgelines, did the math she had learned to do before she had learned to drive. Her hand moved toward her pen, stopped. She thought about standing up, about saying, "Sir, I'm sorry, but has anyone done a threat analysis specific to the upper ridgeline on the north side of the pass?" The angles. She thought about what that would sound like. The communications specialist, interrupting a mission briefing to offer tactical assessment nobody asked for. Calloway would give her a look. The team leaders would exchange glances. Someone would ask what her MOS was, and she would say 25U, signal support, and the room would move on. And if she was wrong, if she had misread the terrain or overfit the pattern from too many evenings studying maps with her father, she would have exposed herself for nothing. She set her pen down, said nothing, told herself the aerial imagery had shown no threat, told herself competent officers had planned this route, told herself she was a communications specialist and her job was frequencies and handsets, not route analysis. She was still telling herself these things when she walked back to her bunk at 2000 hours. She lay awake for 40 minutes. Then she got up, went to the equipment cage, and pulled the rifle case from the locked section she had never opened in front of anyone. It wasn't the rifle she'd been issued. Her father's Accuracy International, an AXMC chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum, had followed her through every posting without anyone asking why a signal soldier was authorized to transport a precision rifle in a locked case. She had listed it on her personal property declaration as a competitive shooting firearm, and nobody had looked twice, because nobody looked twice at anything a signal specialist listed on their property forms. She checked the scope mounts in the dark, running her fingers over the locking rings by feel. She hadn't fired it in 8 months. She hadn't cleaned it in 6. She broke it down on her cot with a headlamp, working through the process with her eyes half closed because she didn't need to see. She needed to feel, and feel confirmed everything was within tolerance. She reassembled it, locked it back in the case, sat on the edge of her cot and stared at the wall for a moment. You're going to bring that rifle on a resupply convoy because you looked at a map for 40 seconds and got a feeling. She almost put the case back. Instead, she packed it into the bottom of her gear bag, under her radio equipment and her cold weather layers, and she set her alarm for 03:45 and lay back down and did not sleep. Morning at 9,000 feet arrives without gentleness. The light comes in cold and flat, throwing hard shadows across rock that has no softness to offer. The convoy vehicles were already running by the time Lena reached the vehicle staging area, their engines producing that low, heavy vibration that diesel motors make when they're warming in cold air. She was assigned to Vehicle 3, a hardback HMMWV with Sergeant Torres riding shotgun and Specialist Yates behind the wheel, a 22-year-old from rural Georgia who drove with one hand on the wheel and talked to his vehicle the way other people talk to pets. "Easy, girl. We got a long day." Torres looked at Lena's gear bag when she loaded it. He was a careful man by nature, the kind who noticed things and filed them without comment. He noticed the weight of the bag. He said nothing. Lena settled into the rear right seat and pulled on her headset, cycling through the assigned frequencies. Alpha Net, Command Net, Medical Net, all clear. She confirmed the check-in sequence with the outpost TOC and got her acknowledgement from Hooper, who was running comms from the rear. Vehicle by vehicle, the convoy rolled out of Frost Ridge at 05:03. 2 minutes late, already behind the time-distance calculation. Lena watched the terrain. The first 30 minutes of the route were open ground, flat enough and wide enough that vehicle spacing could be maintained at 50 meters, and the drivers could hold 40 kilometers per hour without difficulty. Callaway ran a tight formation, which was good. The lead vehicle had a mine roller attached, which was standard procedure, though it slowed the pace and made Yates mutter something under his breath about the iron plow. Lena monitored the radio traffic and watched the ridge lines. Nothing moved that shouldn't have moved. She kept watching anyway. The terrain began to change about 20 minutes out from the pass. The valley walls crept inward. Road quality degraded. Yates dropped to second gear without being told, the transmission complaining in the way older HMMWVs complained when you asked them to work in cold weather. Torres clicked his tongue. Here we go. The corridor was exactly as Lena had known it would be. The northern ridgeline rose sharply to her left, maybe 300 meters of vertical relief, broken by granite outcroppings that provided natural hides every 40 or 50 meters. The southern ridge was lower but angled in a way that created a secondary observation lane across the road. The depression she had noticed on the map appeared on her right at approximately the 200-meter mark past the pass entrance, a shallow bowl that dipped below road grade and looked, from ground level, like natural protection. She was looking at it, measuring it, when the convoy entered the narrowest section of the pass. The quiet lasted approximately 4 more seconds. The first round hit the lead vehicle's hood with a sound like a steel door slamming, and then the world reorganized itself around that single sound in the way that worlds do when violence arrives without announcement. More rounds followed, not rapid fire, not automatic, but the deliberate, methodical cadence of trained shooters working a sequence. The lead vehicle lurched and stopped. The second vehicle braked hard. Yates had them stopped and off the right edge of the road in under 3 seconds, which was either training or instinct or both. And he dropped behind the engine block before Lena had finished processing what was happening. Torres was already out his door. Contact North Ridge." Radio traffic exploded. 3 nets simultaneously, voices bleeding over each other. Alpha 1 reporting the lead vehicle crew was down. Alpha 2 calling for aid. Callaway's voice cutting through with deliberate calm. "All elements, maintain cover. Do not return fire until you have positive ID. We are working the net." Lena had her handset pressed to her ear, performing the function she was there to perform, and she was watching the depression. 2 soldiers from Vehicle 4 were already moving toward it, running low, bent at the waist, using the road berm for concealment as they went. The depression was 30 meters ahead. It looked like a good option. From where she was crouched behind Vehicle 3, it looked like the only option. She keyed her radio before she had fully decided to. "Callaway, this is Mercer. The depression is a secondary kill zone. There is a line of sight from the upper North Ridge straight into that bowl. Tell those men to stop." A beat. 2 beats. The kind of silence that happens when someone says something that doesn't fit the expected conversation. "Say again, Mercer?" The 2 men moving to the depression. Call them back. They'll be exposed from above the moment they clear the berm. There is a hide position on the North Ridge at approximately 290 degrees that has a direct angle into that bowl. They won't survive it. Another beat. Mercer, what is your... Call them back, sir, please. Torres was looking at her. Yates, pressed against the engine block, had turned his head. The expression on his face was the expression of someone who has been told something strange at a very strange time and doesn't know what to do with it. Calloway came back on. Alpha 4, halt. Do not advance to the depression. Confirm halt. Alpha 4's team leader came back confused and frustrated. We need cover. We are taking the... Hold your position. That is a direct order. Hold. The two soldiers stopped. Lena let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The next 6 minutes were the kind that stretch. Every second had texture to it. The sound of rounds finding metal, the radio traffic, someone calling that the lead vehicle gunner was hit. The altitude-thinned air making everything feel slightly unreal. 3 separate shooter positions on the North Ridge. She had identified 2 of them by muzzle flash within the first 2 minutes, cycling through known data. Elevation, approximately 280 meters above road grade. Distance from her position, roughly 400 meters. Wind reading off the dust patterns suggesting 8 to 10 kilometers per hour from the northwest. The third position was quieter, firing less frequently. Waiting. That third position was the one that bothered her. Staff Sergeant Vickers had established a casualty collection point behind vehicles 5 and 6, where the road widened half a meter due to a pullout. He had 2 wounded, the gunner from Vehicle 1, who had taken shrapnel, and a private from Vehicle 2 who had a through-and-through in the forearm. Neither was immediately life-threatening. Both required attention that was currently impossible to provide safely. Calloway called air support and received the answer Lena had already factored. 47 minutes, weather delay at the forward base. 47 minutes. She looked at the rifle case. Sergeant Torres. He was crouched 3 feet from her, scanning the North Ridge with binoculars. He turned. I need you to listen to me for about 30 seconds and try not to ask too many questions yet. His expression did something complicated. Torres was 34 years old, had done 9 years in the Army, and had developed the particular skill of reading situations by reading people. He was reading her now. I'm listening. I have a precision rifle in that bag. My father trained me on long-range shooting from the time I was 9. I am not exaggerating when I tell you I can reach those positions on the North Ridge from the gap between Vehicle 3 and Vehicle 4. I need you to get me 15 seconds of suppression fire on the upper North Ridge. Everyone who has a weapon, maximum rate, at that ridge line. I need the shooters to take cover for 15 seconds. That's all I need. Torres stared at her. She watched him work through it. She watched him measure the distance between what she was saying and what his experience told him was possible from a signals specialist with a soft bag and a calm voice. What do you shoot? 338 La Pua, a XMC. What's your confirmed distance? My father's range. 1,200 meters was where we stopped because we ran out of property. Up there is 400 to 450 with elevation advantage to me. It's not the hard part. The hard part being what? The third shooter. He's quiet. He's waiting. He's either the most patient man on that ridge or he's the one running the other 2, and I haven't placed him yet. Torres looked at the ridge, looked back at her, looked at the bag. You've been here 7 months, he said. Not an accusation, almost like he was confirming something to himself. Yes. And you carry that rifle? Yes. He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then, I need to call Calloway. That's the right call. Do it fast. Calloway's voice, when Torres patched her through, had the controlled tightness of a man managing too many variables simultaneously. Mercer, Torres tells me you have a long-range capability. Yes, sir. What are we talking about? I can take the North Ridge positions, both confirmed positions, and I need a few more seconds to locate the third. I need suppression. 15 seconds. Every weapon in the convoy fires north, maximum rate. That's it. When they go down to avoid it, I move to the gap at Vehicle 3-4. I'll need 30 to 45 seconds per target after that. You're a signals specialist. Yes, sir, I am. A pause. 3 rounds hit Vehicle 2 in rapid succession. Someone shouted something she couldn't make out. Mercer, I don't have 47 minutes and I have 2 men down. If you're telling me you can do this, I'm telling you I can do this. She heard him breathing. She heard the radio traffic behind him. Torres, confirm you've seen the equipment. Torres keyed his radio. Confirmed, sir. It's an AXMC in 338, and sir, she knew about the depression before those men moved. She called it before I could see it. Another silence. Shorter. Mercer. Sir. Don't miss. She pulled the rifle from the bag with hands that she refused to let shake, and she was aware of soldiers watching her. Torres, Yates, 2 riflemen from Vehicle 4 who had repositioned close by. And she was aware of the weight of that watching, and she set it aside because she had learned from her father that the moment you perform for an audience was the moment you stopped performing for the target. She checked the scope. A Schmidt and Bender 5 to 25 times with the elevation turret she had set in controlled conditions and never touched since. She would need to adjust for the cold and the altitude and the fact that she hadn't fired this weapon in 8 months, and her cold weather gear added enough bulk to her cheek weld that she'd need to compensate in her stock position. She did these adjustments in 30 seconds, not because she was showing off, because 30 seconds was what was available. Tell them to prepare to fire, she said to Torres. He was on the radio. She settled into the gap between Vehicle 3 and Vehicle 4, using the rear bumper of 3 as a rest point, and she found the first position on the north ridge in the scope. She had marked it mentally, 11 o'clock from the road center line, behind a granite formation that angled upward on the right side. She could see the edge of it, not the shooter, the edge. That was enough. On your call, Torres said. 3, 2, 1, suppress. The world behind her erupted. Every weapon in the convoy firing on the north ridgeline simultaneously, M4s and the heavier report of the vehicle-mounted guns. The sound physically pressing against her ears even through the hearing protection she'd pulled on. She was already moving. The gap she'd chosen was 18 inches wide and gave her a clear line north at a 15-degree upward angle. She dropped behind the rear bumper, extended the rifle's bipod to its stop, and pressed into the stock with the practiced intimacy of someone who has put thousands of rounds through a platform and knows every specific characteristic of how it feels when it's right. The granite formation at 11 o'clock. Wind, right to left. She could see it in the dust disturbed by the suppression fire. Call it 8 kilometers per hour. Consistent. Distance. Her estimate had been 410. She would shoot for 415 and let the bullet find what it found. The edge of the granite. Movement. A shoulder, pulling back from the fire. Not far enough back. She held her breath at the bottom of an exhale the way her father had taught her, because the bottom of the exhale is where the body is most still, where everything quiets, where the only relationship in the universe is between the crosshairs and the target. Trigger squeeze. Not pull. Squeeze. There is a difference that matters enormously at distance. The rifle spoke. The shoulder behind the granite disappeared. She was already cycling to the second position, 2 o'clock, higher elevation, behind a broken rock formation that made an L shape she'd spotted from the muzzle flash pattern. The suppression fire was still running, had maybe 6 more seconds before Calloway would call it off to conserve ammunition. She found the second position, ahead, visible above the rock for a fraction of a second as the shooter assessed whether the suppression was dying. It wasn't dying. She fired. The head dropped. Cease fire, Calloway said on the net. Report status. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Heavier. Expectant. 2 down, Lena said, and her voice sounded strange to her. Very level, very flat, the way voices get when there is no room for anything else. Still searching for the third. The third shooter didn't fire for 90 seconds after the suppression ended. 90 seconds is a long time when you're lying in an 18-inch gap between vehicles with spent brass from your own weapon cooling near your elbow and your ears ringing despite protection and 23 people waiting for something to happen. Torres was 4 feet to her left, watching with binoculars, calling soft information. 2 o'clock is down, 11 o'clock is down. I've got nothing moving up there. He's there, she said. You sure? 3 shooter teams, always 3. 1 controls, 2 fires, the quiet one controls. How do you know that? My father worked with a training cadre that did OP for scenarios. He talked about it. She kept her eye on the scope. The controller doesn't fire unless the others are gone. He's reassessing right now. He's going to move to a new position, or he's going to try 1 more shot before he extracts. Which? I don't know. She hated saying that. It was the most honest thing she'd said in 7 months. The scope swept the ridgeline in sections, Slow, methodical, the way you don't search for something but let your eye settle on everything in order and wait for the thing that doesn't belong. Rock, rock, shadow, rock. That shadow, slightly wrong. Something about the depth of it, the way it interrupted the natural line of the stone face. She stopped, adjusted right 2 mils. Not a shadow. A shape inside a shadow. Still, patient, watching downward. She measured the position against her last 2 shots, factored the slightly greater distance, maybe 450 now, and the angle difference, which brought the wind into a slightly different geometry than her previous shots. She held, waited. The shape moved. Not much. A small adjustment, the way a person adjusts when they have been still too long and need to shift weight. That was enough. She squeezed. The shape stopped moving. For a moment, nobody spoke. The convoy held its position. The wind moved down the canyon. Dust settled across the road. The engine of Vehicle 2 was still running, idling quietly, and that mundane mechanical sound was the most normal thing in the world, and it was the thing that broke through the shock first for most of the soldiers pressed behind cover. Then Torres said, very quietly, "Holy, get on the net," Lena said. "Tell Calloway the ridgeline is clear. Tell him we need to confirm the wounded and get moving before whatever element those 3 were working with has time to reposition." Torres looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. She had seen it on the faces of men at her father's range club who had come to watch her shoot and then stood in front of the target board doing the arithmetic and coming up short on explanations. He got on the net. Lena ejected the round from the chamber, engaged the safety, and began breaking the weapon down with hands that were, now that there was nothing left to do, trembling slightly. Not badly, but present. She noticed Yates watching her. He was still pressed against the vehicle, one hand on his rifle, staring at her the way you stare at something that doesn't quite fit the category you'd placed it in. "You're a comms specialist," he said. "Yes." "You've been carrying that thing this whole deployment?" "Yes." He looked at the rifle, looked at the ridge, looked back at her. "My whole life," he said slowly, "I have been at the wrong place at the right time. Today feels different." She almost smiled, didn't quite get there. Calloway's voice came on the net. "All elements, we are consolidating casualties and moving in 7 minutes. Vehicle 3 comms. Mercer, I need you on the command net. We're going to talk." "Copy, sir." She looked at the rifle in her hands. The promise she'd made to her mother at a graveside in the rain 5 years ago. The 7 months she'd spent making herself small enough to disappear. 25 people were still alive. She didn't know yet whether that made the breaking of the promise right. She wasn't sure that question had a clean answer. She finished breaking down the weapon, packed it into the case with the same careful economy her father had always insisted upon. Treat it well when you don't need it, so it treats you well when you do. And zipped the bag. Above her, the North Ridge was silent and still. Below on the road, soldiers were moving, and Calloway was waiting on the command net with questions she had been avoiding for 5 years. The convoy reached Firebase Kesler 4 hours later. The 2 wounded soldiers were stabilized and evacuated by helicopter within 30 minutes of arrival. The engagement report, filed by Calloway that evening, listed the neutralization of 3 hostile sniper positions in Raven Pass. In the field for the shooter, he wrote 1 line: "Personnel to be identified." Because even then, in the immediate aftermath, with the evidence of what she had done witnessed by 23 people, he was still trying to fit what Lena Mercer had done into a category that existed in his experience. She was sitting outside the Firebase command building when the intelligence officer came to find her. A major named Solis with a data tablet under one arm and the efficient walk of someone who had been sent to collect a specific thing and intended to collect it quickly. He sat down across from her on the low concrete barrier that divided the parking area from the gravel path. He didn't open with pleasantries. "I need to know who trained you," he said. She looked at him. "My father," she said. "What was his background?" "Competitive shooting? He was a civilian. He trained with former military instructors because he liked precision work, and they were the best teachers for it." "And you never disclosed this capability?" "It wasn't quite a question." "No." "Why not?" She looked at the mountains in the distance, the same mountains she'd been looking at for 7 months. "I made a promise," she said. Solis studied her for a moment. Then he looked down at his tablet and made a note. Captain Calloway is filing a commendation recommendation. General Morrison has been notified. There will be a formal debrief tomorrow morning at 0800 hours. I understand. He stood up, paused. For what it's worth, he said, 3 shooter positions at 400 plus meters in field conditions. After 7 months without confirmed live fire practice, he stopped, shook his head. The ballistics team is going to want to talk to you. I figured. He walked away. Lena sat on the concrete barrier as the sun dropped behind the western peaks, and the temperature fell the way it fell at altitude, abruptly, like a door closing. She pulled her jacket tighter and stared at the mountains and thought about her father, about the graph paper diagrams, about the hours in the blind, counting wind, about the pass, about the depression where 2 soldiers had almost died because she had stayed quiet. That last part stayed with her longer than the rest. She could accept having kept the secret. She could justify it with the promise and the years and the deliberate choice she had made about what kind of soldier she wanted to be. But she could not quite make peace with the briefing room, the pen she had picked up and set down, the 40 seconds of looking at a map that had told her everything she needed to say. She had not said it, and the only reason it hadn't mattered was that she'd been right about everything else too. That's not how it works, her father would have said. The outcome doesn't redeem the decision. The decision has to be right on its own. He had told her that over a cold cup of coffee at their kitchen table 15 years ago, talking about something else entirely. She heard it perfectly clearly now. She was still sitting there when Torres came out and stood beside her without speaking for a moment, the way people do when they've decided to be present before they've decided what to say. Debrief at 0800, he said finally. I know. Calloway's going to ask you about the briefing, about why you didn't say anything. I know. Do you have an answer? She thought about it. I have an honest one, she said. Whether it's a good one, I don't know yet. Torres nodded. He looked at the mountains too. For what it's worth, he said, Yates told the guys in Vehicle 4 what you did. What you said about the depression before those men moved. He paused. Nobody's talking about the comms specialist anymore. She looked at him. He had the expression of someone delivering information that means something, but choosing to deliver it simply. What are they talking about? She asked. They're not sure yet, he said. That's the thing. Nobody has a category for you. He went back inside. Lena stayed where she was until the last light left the sky, and the cold became something that required action, and then she stood up, picked up her gear bag with the rifle case inside it, and walked back into the firebase. Tomorrow there would be questions. There would be a formal record. There would be a conversation she had been postponing for 5 years. And somewhere on the north ridge of Raven Pass, 3 positions she had identified from a map at a briefing table sat empty and cold in the dark. Confirmation of a calculation she had almost kept to herself. She thought about that all the way to her bunk. She was still thinking about it when the satellite phone on the duty desk rang, and the watch officer's voice carried down the hallway with an urgency that had nothing to do with what had happened that morning. Mercer. The watch officer appeared in the doorway of the bunk room. Young face, wide eyes. Command net. For you specifically. It's General Morrison's staff. She looked up. They're not calling about the commendation, the watch officer said. They found something on the ridge, on the 3rd shooter. He glanced down at the notepad in his hand, confirming what he'd written. He was carrying a radio, encrypted, and the traffic they pulled off of it. He stopped, looked at her. What? She said. The ambush wasn't random, he said. They knew the convoy was coming. They knew the route. They knew the timing. He swallowed. And whoever they were coordinating with was on our net, Lena said quietly. The watch officer stared at her. How did you? Because the 3rd shooter was waiting, she said. Quiet, patient, not engaging until the others were down. That's not a sniper covering a retreat. She set the gear bag on her bunk. That's someone waiting for a signal that never came. The hallway was very quiet. Who else is on that call? She asked. Calloway, Major Solis, and... He checked his notepad again. A Captain Warwick from Counterintelligence. He arrived at the Firebase 40 minutes ago. Nobody radioed us that he was coming. Lena looked at the watch officer for a moment. Then she picked up her rifle case and held it. Tell them I'm on my way, she said. The command center at Firebase Kesler occupied the northeast corner of the main building, a room that had been converted from a storage space sometime before Lena's deployment and still carried the faint smell of diesel and cardboard that no amount of ventilation had fully displaced. By the time she walked in, the satellite uplink was already active, and the faces around the table told her everything she needed to know about the weight of what had been found on that ridge. Calloway stood at the head of the table with his arms crossed, not the posture of a man in charge, but of a man managing the realization that things were larger than his authority. Major Solis sat to his left with a laptop open, screen angled away from the door. And at the far end, a man she didn't know. Mid-30s, civilian cut hair that the army hadn't quite grown out yet. The kind of face that had learned stillness as a professional skill, was watching her walk in with an attention that felt different from the attention she'd received from everyone else that day. That would be Captain Warwick. He didn't stand, didn't extend a hand. "Specialist Mercer," he said. "Sit down." She sat. The satellite connection carried the voice of General Morrison's intelligence chief, a colonel named Brandt, whose voice she recognized from the command net and whose face appeared in a small window in the corner of Solis's laptop screen, pixelated by bandwidth and distance. "We're going to walk through this carefully," Brandt said. "What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room until I say otherwise. That includes lateral communication with your home unit, Mercer. That includes anyone not present at this table. Is that understood by everyone?" Around the table, confirmations. Solis, Calloway, Warwick. Lena said, "Yes, sir." And notice Warwick's eyes moved to her when she did. "The radio recovered from the third shooter is an AN/PRC 152 variant. Modified. The encryption suite is ours, not adversarial. Whoever gave that man a radio gave him one that can authenticate on our tactical nets. The traffic pulled from the device in the last 72 hours includes 3 transmissions." Brandt paused. The connection flickered briefly. The first transmission occurred at 23:14 hours 2 nights ago. It contained the convoy route, the departure time, and the vehicle count. The room was quiet. Lena looked at the table, thought about the briefing. 30 people in that room. Calloway, team leaders, drivers, support personnel. She had sat in the back row and said nothing. Someone else in that room had done something considerably worse. "The second transmission occurred at 0128 hours last night," Brandt continued. "It confirmed the original information. And the third," another pause, longer. "The third transmission came in at 0447 this morning, 18 minutes before convoy departure. It confirmed the convoy was moving on schedule." Calloway uncrossed his arms. "That transmission came from inside Frost Ridge. From inside the communications window of Frost Ridge Outpost, yes. We cannot confirm the physical location of the transmitter beyond that. The signal is directional, short burst, designed to minimize detection. Whoever sent it knew how to send it." Warwick spoke for the first time since she'd sat down. "Which narrows the field to people who understand tactical communications protocol." He let that sentence sit for a moment, then looked directly at Lena. "How long have you been at Frost Ridge?" 7 months. "And your MOS is 25U, signal support." "That's correct." "You understand the AN/PRC 152 family." "I maintain that equipment, yes." "You understand encryption authentication protocol." "It's part of my job." "And you were in the briefing room last night when the convoy plan was presented." Calloway said, "Warwick, with a warning in it." "I'm establishing the field," Warwick said, not looking at Calloway. He was still looking at Lena. "I'm going to ask everyone in this room the same questions. That's not a slight, it's a process." Lena met his eyes. "I was in the briefing room. I know the 152 family and the encryption authentication suite. I also spent this morning shooting 3 people off a ridge to keep that convoy alive." She said it evenly, not defensively. The way you state a fact that belongs in evidence. Make of that what you need to. Warwick's expression didn't change. He made a note on a small paper pad he kept to his left. "Where were you between 0400 and 0503 this morning?" he asked. "Vehicle staging area." "I arrived at 0412. Yates was already running the engine. Torres arrived at 0421. I ran frequency checks at 0430 and 0445. The TOC copy of those checks will show my radio signature on the net at both timestamps. That covers 0430 onward. What about 0400 to 0430? I was walking from my bunk to the staging area, alone. Anyone see you? I don't know. Warwick wrote something else. Brant's voice came through the laptop. Mercer, this isn't an accusation. I want to be clear about that. Warwick is doing his job and we're doing this with everyone who was in that briefing room. What I actually want to discuss with you is something different. A pause. You identified the ambush site before it happened. How? She had expected this question. She had been half composing the answer since she'd sat down outside the building an hour ago. I recognized the terrain geometry, she said. The pass configuration, the ridgeline elevations, the road angle, the false cover depression. It matched a pattern my father used to diagram when he explained how ambush sites get selected. He had a background in long-range competitive shooting and trained with former military instructors. He was interested in how terrain gets used tactically. He spent a lot of time teaching me to read it. And you didn't disclose this during the briefing? No, sir. Why not? She didn't answer immediately. Warwick had gone still in the way he'd been still when she walked in, which she was beginning to understand meant he was paying maximum attention. I was concerned about being wrong, she said, and I was concerned about what it would reveal about my background. That you had this capability. Yes. Which you've been concealing for how long? Since I enlisted. 5 years. The satellite connection held a silence that felt considered rather than technical. All right, Brant said finally. Here's where we are. We have a mole somewhere inside Frost Ridge Outpost, or within the information distribution chain for Frost Ridge operational planning. We have 25 personnel who attended that briefing. Warwick's team is going to work through that list. In the meantime, we have a separate situation, which is that we now know you exist, Mercer, and we need to figure out what to do with that. Another pause. Get some sleep. Both issues will still be here in the morning. The connection closed. The room sat with the weight of what had just been said. Calloway looked at Lena with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something between respect and the discomfort that comes from realizing you've been wrong about someone for 7 months, and only the specifics of exactly how wrong remain to be cataloged. Go get some sleep, he said. It was almost an echo of Brant, which she thought was probably unintentional. She stood. Warwick looked up from his notepad. Don't go anywhere tomorrow without checking in first. Where would I go? She said. He didn't smile. But something in his face shifted approximately in the direction of a smile, the way faces do when they're acknowledging something without quite admitting it. She went to her bunk and did not sleep for a long time. The firebase at night had its own particular stillness, different from the outpost stillness, which was the stillness of altitude and exposure. Firebase Kesler's stillness was more populated, generators running somewhere behind the maintenance building, the occasional voice from the watch rotation, a helicopter on the pad that hadn't been there when the convoy arrived. The sounds of an installation that was always, on some level, awake. Lena lay on her back and stared at the ceiling of the temporary bunk structure and ran through the briefing room in her head. Not the terrain analysis that she had already processed to whatever conclusion was available. She ran through the people. She had been in the back row. She had not paid attention to individuals because she was there for radio assignments and had been paying attention to the projected map. She could account for Calloway at the front, Torres to her left, Hooper in the row ahead. The team leaders, she knew Vickers, had worked with him on frequency coordination. She knew Staff Sergeant Polk from Vehicle 4, who had the habit of chewing pens during any administrative event that lasted more than 15 minutes. After that, her recall became general, bodies in chairs, the specific anonymity of uniformed personnel in a low-lit room. She thought about who would have had the technical capability to modify an AN/PRC-152 to run on their encryption suite. That narrowed things considerably. The 152 family wasn't complicated equipment, but authentication protocol wasn't common knowledge outside signals and intelligence personnel. At Frost Ridge, signals personnel amounted to herself, Torres, and Wills, with Hooper running the section. She could add communications adjacent roles, the TOC operators, the intelligence sergeant, the fire support officer who interfaced with air assets. 8, maybe 10 people with the background to do it correctly. She thought about Wills, 20 years old, still in the phase where he thought everything was temporary. She thought about Torres, who had watched her pull a rifle from a bag this morning and asked exactly the right questions and acted exactly the right way. She thought about Hooper, who had been at Frost Ridge for 4 months and had the comfortable efficiency of someone who has been in the Army long enough to understand which systems he actually needed versus which ones existed in the manual. She was not conducting an investigation. She knew that. She was a signals specialist with a precision rifle and a commendation recommendation and a counterintelligence captain who had just spent 20 minutes establishing whether she had the motive and technical capability to have called in her own convoy's route to a hostile element, which was, she admitted in the dark, a reasonable question given everything on paper. She turned on her side, thought about the third shooter's radio. Short burst transmission, directional, designed to minimize detection. That required more than technical knowledge. That required equipment modification. That required time and access and a reason. She closed her eyes, and eventually, after approximately 90 minutes of this, something behind the analysis let go and she slept. Morning at Firebase Kesler was louder than morning at Frost Ridge. More personnel, more machinery. The rhythm of a larger installation asserting itself at 0600 with formation calls and vehicle checks and the smell of the mess facility's breakfast production drifting across the gravel paths between buildings. Lena was at the command building at 0745, 15 minutes ahead of the 0800 debrief call. Warwick was already there, which she suspected meant he had not left. He was at a folding table outside the command room with a paper cup of coffee and the small notepad, and he looked up when she arrived with the expression of someone who has been awake long enough that surprise no longer registers efficiently. "You're early," he said. "So are you." "I haven't slept." He said it matter-of-factly, without the competitive edge some people put on not sleeping. Just information. She sat down on the opposite side of the folding table without being invited, because there was nowhere else to sit, and standing felt performative. "Where's Calloway?" she asked. "Coordinating with the Firebase commander about the wounded. Both soldiers are stable. The gunner is being evacuated to Bagram this morning." He took a drink of his coffee. "I have a question for you, off the record." "There's no off the record with counterintelligence." "Probably not," he agreed, "but I'm asking anyway." He set the cup down. "Why did you stay in signals?" She looked at him. "You have a capability that would have placed you in a completely different training pipeline," he said. "If you disclosed it at enlistment, or at any point in 5 years, you're looking at a ranger assessment, a special forces assessment, scout sniper school. Instead, you've been maintaining radio equipment at a forward outpost in the mountains." He studied her. "I'm not asking because it's relevant to the investigation. I'm asking because I've been doing this long enough that I find the answer interesting." She considered not answering, decided the honest answer was also the simpler answer. "I made a promise to my mother after my father died," she said. "I promised I wouldn't use what he taught me in a dangerous context. And maintaining equipment at a forward outpost in a conflict zone is not a dangerous context. I kept the two things separate in my head. For 5 years. Yes." He looked at her for a moment. How'd that work out? She didn't answer that one. He hadn't really expected her to. The command room door opened and Solus appeared, waving them in. Behind him, Calloway, and behind Calloway, 2 people Lena hadn't seen the night before. A woman in her 40s in civilian clothes with the bearing of someone who has worn a uniform recently enough that it still shows in how she stands, and a younger man with a laptop bag and the specific alertness of someone who has been briefed on something and is waiting to see how it lands in person. The woman looked at Lena with an attention that was different from Warwick's attention. More evaluative, less investigative. "I'm Dr. Reyes," the woman said. "I work with the Precision Personnel Assessment Program out of JSOC. I flew in this morning." Lena looked at her, then at the younger man with the laptop bag, then back at Reyes. "They sent you overnight," she said. "We were already in country," Reyes said. "Different tasking. We got redirected." Calloway said, "Let's sit down." They sat. The debrief ran for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Which was longer than Lena had expected and covered considerably more ground. The first hour was Warwick's. He ran through the timeline of the ambush, the convoy departure, the engagement sequence, the radio traffic, the recovery of the modified PRC-152 from the third shooter's position. He was thorough and precise and asked questions that seemed simple until you realized they were designed to map the consistency of responses across multiple retellings. He asked Lena to walk through her morning 3 separate times, in different orders, which she did without a protest because she understood the methodology. When he had what he needed, he closed his notepad and handed the room to Solis, who presented the signal's intelligence assessment. The modified radio had been sourced with high confidence from a procurement chain that passed through a logistics hub 400 kilometers south. The modification itself, the authentication suite integration, required access to current cryptographic keys, which rotated on a classified schedule. The rotation that the radio suite was keyed to had been distributed to 14 installations in the region, of which Frost Ridge was one. 14 installations, Reyes said. How many personnel with access to the key distribution? In the region? Several hundred. At Frost Ridge specifically? Solis glanced at his notes. 11 people were in the distribution chain for that rotation. Names? Solis passed a printed list across the table. Reyes looked at it, passed it to the man with the laptop bag, who Lena had learned was named Garrett, and who worked in signals intelligence analysis. Garrett looked at the list. His face did something small. What? Warwick asked. Garrett set the list flat on the table and pointed to a name near the middle. This person transferred to Frost Ridge 6 weeks ago. Prior posting was the logistics hub we sourced the radio modification to. The room processed that. Lena looked at the name. Corporal Dennis Hale. She knew the name from the personnel roster. Didn't have a face attached to it yet. Frost Ridge had 25 assigned personnel, and she had deliberately kept her social footprint small. Signal support section didn't interface much with the communications security side of the house, which was a separate sub-function that... She stopped, looked at Solis. Who runs ComSec at Frost Ridge? She asked. Solis checked his notes. The ComSec custodian on record is... He stopped, looked up. Corporal Hale, Warwick said. The ComSec custodian was the person who received and managed cryptographic key distribution, who had physical access to the key loading devices, who could, with patience and motive, extract a current authentication suite and load it onto a modified radio before distributing that radio through a logistics chain to a hostile element. The room was very quiet. Calloway said, he was in the briefing room. Everyone in the section was in the briefing room, Solis said. That was standard. He was also, Calloway said slowly, on the duty roster for 0400 to 0600 this morning, TOC watch. The 0447 transmission, 18 minutes before convoy departure. Sent from inside the communications window of Frost Ridge, from the TOC. Warwick was already on his phone. So, what followed was not fast, because these things are never fast when done correctly. Warwick coordinated with the Firebase commander and with Morrison's staff through channels that moved carefully, because moving carelessly when you're reaching back to an active outpost to detain a personnel you suspect of information compromise tends to cause the thing you're trying to prevent, which is the compromise knowing it's been discovered and acting accordingly. Lena sat in the command room and waited, which was the function she had been assigned, and she performed it badly because waiting was not her natural function, and the situation kept pulling at threads she hadn't finished following. Reyes came back into the room around 1100 and sat across from her with a tablet, and the posture of someone who has decided to have a different kind of conversation. Tell me about your training, she said. Not the operational account. I've read Calloway's report. Tell me about what your father taught you, how it actually worked. Lena looked at her. Is this the assessment? She asked. It's a conversation, Reyes said. You can call it whatever helps. Fair enough. She talked about her father for the first time in 5 years, in a way that wasn't shaped by the need to conceal. She talked about the range sessions that started when she was 9, and the way he explained the physics, not as rules to memorize, but as a system to understand, because he believed that if you understood why, you would never need to be told what. She talked about the graph paper diagrams and the hours in the blind, and the first time she shot a group at 1,000 yards, and her father stood behind the spotting scope for a long moment without speaking. What did he say? Reyes asked. He said, You're going to need to learn patience because the hard part isn't the shot. The hard part is everything before the shot. You were 14? 13. The 1,000-yard group started at 13. Reyes made a note on her tablet. What do you mean by everything before the shot? Position, reading conditions, target analysis, patience to wait for the right moment instead of the available moment. He used to say that most bad shots happen before the shooter touches the trigger. She paused. He also meant it more broadly. He meant knowing when to act and when to hold. He applied it to a lot of situations. Like the briefing room. The words landed precisely. Lena looked at Reyes. That's not what I was talking about. I know, but it's where you went when I said it. She had. She didn't deny it. I held when I should have acted, she said. I knew that last night. I still know it. Why did you hold? I already answered that question. You answered it to Brandt. I'm asking for a different kind of answer. Reyes set her tablet down. You knew the terrain. You had the read, and you held. That's not a promise to your mother. That's something else on top of the promise. Lena was quiet for a moment. I didn't want them to know what I could do, she said. And I told myself it was the promise, but it wasn't just the promise. It was... She stopped. Being invisible, Reyes said. Lena looked at her. It's in Calloway's report, Reyes said. He describes you as someone who had made themselves invisible. His word. He meant it as an observation about your social profile, but I think it's more accurate than he realized. Lena didn't answer. The question I'm trying to answer, Reyes said, is whether what happened yesterday was a failure of judgment or a failure of permission. Whether you didn't speak up because you made a wrong call or because you don't have an internal model that includes you as someone who gets to speak up. The room hummed with the sound of the air handling system. That's a question, Lena said finally, that I don't have a clean answer to. I know, Reyes said. That's why it's interesting. A knock at the door. Garrett came in with his laptop open, turning the screen toward Warwick, who had reappeared in the doorway behind him. Something had happened. Warwick's face was controlled in the specific way that faces get controlled when the news is bad and needs to be managed carefully. What? Calloway said. We sent a courier team back to Frost Ridge, Warwick said. Discreet, no advanced communication. Standard procedure for a detainment of this type. He set his hand flat on the doorframe. Hale is gone. The word sat in the room. Gone as in, Calloway started. Gone as in not present. His bunk is cleared. His personal gear is gone. The duty log shows him completing his TOC watch at 0600, standard handoff to the morning watch. No one saw him after 0615. Warwick's jaw was tight. Someone told him. Someone at Frost Ridge knew we were coming for him and passed the word. How, Solis said. We kept this completely not completely enough, Warwick said. Whoever told him knew about this room, knew about this conversation. He looked around the table. Then he looked at Lena, not with accusation, with the particular attention of someone who is recalibrating. The 14 people on the key distribution list, he said. I need to know if any of them have left Frost Ridge in the last 3 hours. We're running it, Garrett said. Lena was looking at the list on the table, the list that had been passed around the room. She had held it for approximately 4 seconds before passing it to Garrett. In that time, she had scanned it. Not memorized, scanned, and one name near the bottom had flagged something she hadn't been able to place until now. Warwick, she said. He looked at her. The list, name near the bottom. Staff Sergeant Olin Breck. She kept her voice level. He's not signals personnel. Warwick looked at Solis. What's his role? Solis was already pulling records. Fire Support Coordinator. He interfaces with the Air Asset Network, which is why he's on the distribution chain. He needs current authentication for air corridor deconfliction. Breck was at the briefing, Calloway said. He said it slowly, like he was watching a picture develop. He's also... He stopped. What? Warwick said. Calloway looked like a man who had just been handed something cold. He's the one who recommended the Raven Pass route, he said. I asked him for an analysis of the 2 options 2 days ago. He came back the same afternoon with a written assessment recommending the pass. Said the lower route had degraded surfaces and the time cost wasn't worth it. The room was very quiet. Lena thought about the 40-second look at a map that had told her the pass was a funnel. Thought about a man with fire support experience. A man who understood terrain, who understood angles, who spent his professional life thinking about where things came from and where they landed. Recommending that corridor to a captain who trusted his assessment, not because it was the best route, because it was the right shape. "Where's Breck right now?" Warwick said. Garrett was already typing. His hands stopped. He looked up. "He signed out of Frost Ridge at 0820 this morning," Garrett said. "Requisitioned a vehicle for a forward coordination visit to Firebase Kesler." Calloway stood up. "He's here." Warwick was already moving. What happened next took 11 minutes and occurred largely in the vehicle lot on the eastern edge of Firebase Kesler, where a tan HMMWV sat running with Staff Sergeant Olin Breck in the driver's seat and a bag in the back that, when later inventoried, contained a modified AN/PR C152 radio, 2 encrypted storage devices, and enough documentation to occupy a counterintelligence team for 6 months. Lena was not part of the 11 minutes in the vehicle lot. She stayed in the command room because Warwick had told her to stay in the command room, and she had the practical clarity to recognize that she was a signals specialist with a rifle and not a counterintelligence operative, and the correct function for her in that moment was to stay out of the way. She heard the vehicle lot from the command room window. Raised voices. Not shots, not violence, just the specific sound of a situation ending with the physics of overwhelm rather than resistance. Calloway came back in 6 minutes after it was done and stood in the doorway with an expression that had the quality of aftermath. "He had a second radio in the vehicle," Calloway said. "Already keyed and set. If he'd gotten another 2 hours..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Lena thought about the convoy route recommendation. The written assessment that had sent 25 people into a corridor that a man with fire support experience had spent 2 days designing around a 3-shooter ambush team. The 0447 transmission from the TOC. Hale at the watch station, passing the confirmation. Breck in a vehicle lot, 40 minutes from being gone. She thought about the briefing room, about the pen she had picked up and set down. If she had spoken, if she had stood up and said, "I don't think this route is safe. Here's why. I know I'm just a signal specialist, but look at the geometry." The route might have changed, or Calloway might have overruled her and sent the convoy anyway. Or it might have triggered a conversation that gave Breck enough warning to accelerate the timeline. She didn't know. She would never know. What she knew was that she had held when she should have acted, and 25 people had survived anyway, and the reason they had survived was that she'd also packed a rifle she had promised not to use, which made the moral accounting of the whole thing complicated in a way she wasn't going to resolve in a command room at Firebase Kesler on the second day of a situation that hadn't finished developing yet. Reyes came back in and sat across from her again. "How are you doing?" she asked. "I'm fine." Reyes looked at her steadily. "You don't have to say that to me." Lena looked at the table. She stopped, started again. "I'm trying to figure out where the yesterday fits with everything else, and I can't quite do it yet." That's honest. It doesn't feel like enough. It rarely does. Reyes folded her hands. "For what it's worth, let's say, and I'll tell you this as a professional observation, not a reassurance, you made 2 bad calls yesterday and 1 extraordinary one. You stayed quiet in the briefing room. You waited until you were out of options to reveal your capability. Both of those cost time and risk that wouldn't have existed if you'd operated differently." She paused. "And then, in a situation with no good options, you did something that most people with your skill set don't do, which is apply it correctly under conditions that would have prevented most people from applying it at all." "Most people don't have 5 years of practice hiding it," Lena said. "No," Reyes agreed. "They don't." The satellite uplink chimed from the corner of the room. Garrett moved to answer it. Brant's voice came through, more clearly than the night before. Better connection or less weather. "Warwick, confirm Breck is in custody." "Confirmed, sir." Warwick had come back in during Reyes' conversation. 2 modified radios, encrypted storage, documentation package. We have a full haul. "Hale? Still outstanding. We have the region flagged." "He won't get far," Brant said. "We've closed the exit corridors." A pause. "Mercer." "Sir." You're being held at Firebase Kesler pending formal debrief by General Morrison's staff. That's going to happen tomorrow morning, and I'll be on that call. Between now and then, I want you to think about something. Sir, the program Dr. Reyes runs. Think about whether you want to know more about it. That's not an order, it's an invitation. Another pause, shorter. And Mercer, the route recommendation came from Breck. We went back through the planning record. Calloway made his decision based on a written fire support assessment that Breck falsified. The briefing room decision was Calloway's to make, and it was made on corrupted information. The connection held a beat. That's not the same thing as saying your silence was the right call, but I want you to have the complete picture. Yes, sir, she said. Thank you. The connection dropped. She sat with that for a moment. The corrupted assessment. The route recommendation built on falsified analysis, passed to a captain who had no reason to question his fire support coordinator's professional judgment. It didn't resolve the briefing room. The fact that Calloway's decision was based on bad information didn't mean her silence was without cost. It meant the cost had been contained by factors outside her control. That was not the same as the decision having been right, but it changed the shape of what she was carrying. Torres appeared in the doorway. He had come in with the Firebase protection detail that Warwick had pulled in for the vehicle lot situation and had been somewhere on the perimeter for the last 2 hours. He looked at her across the room. "You all right?" he said. "You're the second person to ask me that. What did you tell the first one?" "That I was fine." "And?" She looked at him. "And I'm working on it," she said. He nodded. That seemed to be the right answer, or at least an honest one, because he came in and sat down and didn't push further, which was the thing she needed most from another human being at that particular moment, and which, she reflected, Torres had consistently been good at providing without being asked. Reyes was watching them both. The evaluative attention was still there, but it had softened into something more observational, the way a person watches a situation they've decided they don't need to intervene in. Outside in the vehicle lot, the HMMWV that had been Breck's transport sat with its engine off and its doors open. The bag from the back seat was being inventoried on a folding table by 2 personnel in gloves. And somewhere between Frost Ridge and whatever exit corridor Hale had been running toward, a 20-year-old who had thought everything was temporary was discovering that some things were permanent, after all. Lena looked at the window. The mountains beyond the Firebase wire were the same mountains they had always been. Indifferent, precise, measuring nothing and everything simultaneously. She thought about her father's voice at a kitchen table. The hard part isn't the shot. The hard part is everything before the shot. She was beginning to think he had meant that in more ways than she'd understood at 13. The mountains beyond the Firebase wire did not change with what happened inside the wire, which was the thing about mountains that Lena found either comforting or infuriating depending on the hour. At 1400, with the Breck situation resolved into the particular bureaucratic stillness that follows an arrest, paperwork, chain of custody, the systematic disassembly of a man's access and authority into a series of documented steps, the mountains were the same as they had been at 0500 when the convoy rolled out of Frost Ridge into what they didn't know yet. She was still at the folding table when Warwick came back in and told her she could stand down until the 0800 Morrison debrief. "Stand down where?" she said. "There's temporary billeting in the East Block. Torres already has a room. Reyes arranged it." He set a room assignment slip on the table without ceremony. "Get food, get sleep. Don't talk to anyone outside this room about anything we discussed today." "Understood." "Mercer." He paused at the doorway. "The rifle. Where is it right now?" "In my gear bag, in the command room." "It stays in the command room tonight." He said it without apology, which she respected more than if he'd softened it. "Not a restriction, a precaution. You're still on the fringe of an open investigation, and I need the instrument to be accounted for." "Fine." He left. She ate in the Firebase mess facility at 1530, alone at a corner table, which was habit, and sat with a tray of food that was better than Frost Ridge's by a meaningful margin and tasted like nothing in particular because she was not paying attention to it. She was running the Breck situation on a loop, not to solve anything that hadn't been solved, but because her mind did this with incomplete situations regardless of whether completion was available. It found the open ends and pulled at them, The thing that kept snagging was the route recommendation. Breck had submitted a written fire support assessment recommending Raven Pass. That assessment was the architecture of the whole operation. Without it, Calloway might have chosen the lower route, added time, maybe varied the departure hour. The ambush had been designed around the pass, which meant the pass recommendation had been the first act of the operation, not the 0447 radio transmission. Breck had been running this for longer than the last 48 hours. How much longer was a question for Warwick and Garrett, and the 6 months of documentation in the seized bag. Torres sat down across from her with his own tray and the unhurried manner of someone who had decided his presence was sufficient without any additional performance required. "You're doing the loop," he said. "The what?" "The thing where you go over it again. I can tell because you've been moving your food around the tray for 5 minutes without eating any of it." She looked down. He was right. "It's a productive habit," she said. "Is it?" She ate a forkful of something that was probably supposed to be rice. "I keep coming back to how long Breck was running this before yesterday. Counterintelligence will figure that out. I know. I'm just—" She stopped, set the fork down. If the route recommendation was the start of the operation and he submitted that assessment 2 days ago, then the convoy was targeted before the briefing even happened, before anyone in that room made a decision. The briefing room wouldn't have changed the target, Torres said. It would have changed the route. Maybe. If Calloway had taken your read over his fire support coordinator's written assessment, that's not a sure thing. She looked at him. "I'm not letting you off the hook," he said. "You should have spoken up. But you're building a case where if you'd spoken up, everything goes differently, and I don't think that's certain. The ambush was built into the planning cycle 2 days before you sat in that room." She thought about that. "Doesn't fix the briefing room," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "But it's a different problem than the one you've been carrying." She ate some of the rice. It was fine, adequate. The kind of meal that existed to fuel rather than to be experienced. "Reyes asked me about what my father taught me," she said. "What did you tell her?" "I told her about the range, the training, what it actually was." She paused. "It was the first time I've talked about it, really talked about it, in 5 years. Torres was quiet for a moment. "How'd that feel?" She thought about it honestly, which she didn't always do with that type of question. "Strange," she said, "like saying something in a language you haven't used in a long time. You remember it, but it sounds different coming out of you than it used to." He nodded, ate his food, didn't push. That was, she thought, why she was sitting at this table instead of alone at a corner table in the East Block with her back to a wall that didn't interest her. At 200, she woke up to someone knocking on the billeting room door. Not a polite knock, the kind of knock that means now. She was sitting up before she was fully awake, the particular alertness of sleeping somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere that hadn't settled into safe yet. And she had the room's general geometry mapped before she reached the door, which had a bolt she'd confirmed the function of before she'd gone to sleep. She did not open it immediately. "Who?" she said. "Garrett." A pause. "We have a situation. Warwick needs you in the command room." She looked at the door. "Give me 90 seconds, she said. She dressed in the dark the way she'd learned to dress in the army, which is to say by memory and without wasted motion, and she was at the command room in 2 minutes. Warwick was at the table with Garrett, and a face she hadn't seen before. A senior NCO, probably late 30s, with the specific compactness of someone who spent a significant portion of his professional life in environments where size was a liability. He looked at her when she came in with an assessment that was professional and completed quickly. The way you assess a new element when you're in the middle of something and don't have time for social architecture. Solis was on the satellite link. "What happened?" Lena said. Warwick said, "Sit down." She sat. At 23:40 hours, a coalition observation post at grid November Kilo 774 received a radio contact, Warwick said. Encrypted, authenticated, same suite as the Breck radios. He set a printed log on the table. The transmission contained coordinates and a timestamp. For what? For a secondary operation. He looked at her. The coordinates are Firebase Kesler. The timestamp is 0600. She looked at the log, looked at the time on the wall clock. 213. 3 hours, 47 minutes, she said. Give or take. What kind of secondary operation? The NCO she didn't know spoke for the first time. My name is Sergeant Major Dade. I run the direct action element attached to this firebase. He said it without preamble, the way people who have been doing a thing long enough to stop introducing it usually say their names, almost incidentally. We intercepted what appears to be a coordinated indirect fire plan targeting the Firebase command building and the vehicle lot. 12 to 15 mortar positions, pre-calculated from a surveyed observation point. He set a map on the table. The observation point is here. He put his finger on a ridgeline approximately 2 kilometers northeast of the Firebase perimeter. Elevated, clear line of sight to both target areas, concealed approach from the northern draw. Lena looked at the map. 2 kilometers. Northeast ridgeline. The elevation profile was visible even on the printed map. A series of rock formations running east to west across the ridgeline top. Natural spacing, natural depth. She thought about it the way she thought about all terrain, not as an abstraction, but as a physical space she was placing herself inside. How many personnel at the observation point? She asked. Unknown, Dade said. Minimum 1 for the survey. Possibly a fire control element. 2 to 4 personnel directing the mortar teams. Where are the mortar teams? Unknown. The coordinates in the transmission are for the observation point only. We assess the tubes are somewhere in the low ground north of the firebase, beyond the ridgeline. The observation point calls adjustments. She studied the map. Warwick said, I'm going to be honest with you about where we are. The Firebase's own counter-mortar radar is down for a scheduled maintenance cycle that started at 2,000 hours and won't be back online until 700. We have visual observation on our perimeter, but the northeast ridgeline is outside effective range for our ground-based optical systems at night. He folded his hands. And our rapid reaction aviation is currently supporting a separate engagement 30 kilometers south. ETA back here is 0600, Garrett said. Approximately. She looked at the map. She looked at the wall clock. She looked at Warwick. You need the observation point neutralized before they can call a fire mission, she said. What I need, Warwick said, is to understand what options are available to me in the next 3 hours and 45 minutes. She looked back at the map. 2 kilometers. Northeast ridgeline. In the dark, in cold mountain air, at a target she couldn't confirm the position of beyond a grid reference from an intercepted transmission. This was not the same as the pass. The pass had been a known engagement. She'd had terrain she'd studied, visible muzzle flash to locate targets, the structured pressure of an ongoing firefight to clarify everything. This was different. This was reaching out into the dark at a position she couldn't confirm to neutralize a threat she couldn't see yet, in a window she couldn't expand. What's the wind doing right now? She asked. Dade looked at her. Northeast to southwest, Garrett said. Firebase weather station has it at 12 to 15 kilometers per hour, consistent for the last 2 hours. 2 kilometers, northeast ridgeline. That's approximately, she did the calculation. 2,200 meters to the near edge of that formation, 30 to 40 additional meters to the likely observation position inside the formation. The room was quiet. In the dark, Warwick said. Not a challenge. A statement of the variable she hadn't addressed yet. In the dark, she agreed. She had shot in low light before. Her father had been rigorous about condition variation, not because he was training her for situations like this one, but because he believed that capability existed only where it had been practiced, and limiting range time to daylight was limiting capability by half. The Schmidt and Bender had a first focal plane reticle and an illuminated center dot that functioned in ambient light down to a level that was, in his assessment, darker than most situations you'd encounter. The question was the target. In the pass, she'd had muzzle flash and movement. On the northeast ridgeline at 0200 on a cold mountain night, she had a grid reference and a logical assumption about how a fire control element would position itself, and the knowledge that if she was wrong, the Firebase absorbed a mortar strike at 0600 that she had been standing 200 feet from when they asked her if she could prevent it. I need my rifle, she said. Warwick looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Dade. Dade said, I have 2 operators I can put on an infiltration route. They can get to the near slope of that ridgeline in about 90 minutes, but they can't guarantee a quiet clearance of an unknown strength position in the dark without making noise that alerts the mortar teams. He paused. If the mortar teams get a trigger signal instead of a fire mission, a compromise signal, we have no way to know what they do with it. They execute on the coordinates they already have, Lena said, without adjustment, which means less accuracy, but still a fire base with no counter-mortar radar. That's the assessment, Dade agreed. Warwick said, Mercer, I need a straight answer. At 2 kilometers at night against a target you can't confirm, what is your actual probability of success? She looked at him. It would have been easy to say something that sounded like confidence. It would have been easy to give him a number. She had learned, in 7 months of being invisible, that people in rooms like this one trusted numbers more than qualifications, and that a qualified number frequently got less traction than an unqualified one. She did not do that. I don't have a probability, she said. I have an assessment. If the fire control element is positioned inside that rock formation in a way consistent with how a trained observer sets up, which means elevation, concealment, clear sight line to target, then there's a predictable geometry to where they'll be. If I'm right about the geometry, and if the illuminated reticle gives me enough contrast against the sky at that distance, and if the wind holds consistent, then I can work those positions. If any of those variables are wrong, I might not confirm a target until they've already called the mission. And if they call the mission before you confirm, then Dade's teams need to be in a position to disrupt the tubes, which means they need to be moving now. Warwick and Dade looked at each other. Something passed between them that wasn't quite a conversation. The shorter exchange that happens between people who have worked together long enough to compress a lot of words into a moment of eye contact. Teams move in 10 minutes, Dade said. Infiltration route through the south draw, swing northeast. I'll have them at the ridgeline base in 90 minutes and holding. They do not engage unless they hear an active fire mission command. Warwick nodded, looked at Lena. Get your rifle. T. She set up on the Firebase's northern observation platform, a reinforced position on top of the perimeter wall, 2 meters of concrete and sandbag with a firing shelf that had been built for a crew-served weapon and was, structurally, adequate for her purpose. The platform gave her elevation above the Firebase floor, which mattered because the northeast ridgeline was slightly higher than the Firebase grade, and every additional meter of shooter elevation helped. Garrett rigged a wind sensor to the platform rail and ran the data to his tablet. 12 kilometers per hour, northwest. A degree or two shifted from the earlier reading. She factored that. Set her elevation turret for 2,200 meters using the dope she kept in a small notebook that had traveled in the rifle case for 5 years. Filling in the altitude correction from memory, because the notebook gave sea-level data, and she was at altitude, and the math was math, she knew. The Schmidt and Bender had an illuminated center dot. She dialed it to its lowest setting, the minimum that would still be visible against a dark background, because she'd learned that overlit reticles degraded your ability to pick up subtle target definition at the edge of visual range. The northeast ridgeline sat approximately 2 kilometers out, and looked through the scope like the ridgeline looked in the dark, which is to say it was a mass of shapes and shadows with no clean definition until your eyes learned the pattern. She spent 12 minutes doing nothing except looking at it, not searching, learning, letting the ambient light. There was a quarter moon and a clear sky, and the baseline luminosity of a mountain night without cloud cover settle into her visual processing until she understood the specific texture of that ridgeline's darkness. Her father had taught her this. Before you look for the target, look at everything else. When you know everything else, the target becomes the thing that doesn't belong. Dade came up to the platform once, confirmed the teams were moving, gave her a radio. Channel 3, he said. Teams report on that channel. If they hear fire command, you'll hear it from me on Channel 1. Copy. How are you doing up here? She almost said fine. Cold, she said instead, which was true. And I need about 5 more minutes of dark adaptation before I have the ridgeline reading clearly. You've got time. He went back down. She looked at the ridgeline. The thing about waiting in position, the thing her father had spent years teaching her to do, which she had spent years of adult life never using for its intended purpose, was that it existed in its own particular mental state. Not patience, exactly, because patience implied wanting something and waiting for it. It was more like suspension, the internal equivalent of holding a breath at the bottom of an exhale, the moment before the moment. She was very good at it. She had been good at it since she was 9 years old, sitting in a blind with her father while he explained why most people couldn't do this, Not because they lacked physical capability, but because they couldn't get out of their own way long enough to let the target come to them. "You don't go hunting for the shot," he'd said. "You make the shot available, and you're there when it arrives." At 0311, the ridgeline gave her something. Not movement, exactly. A change in the texture of shadow at approximately the 11 o'clock position on the formation, where a cluster of rocks created a natural platform at the elevation she would have chosen if she were setting an observation post. The change was small, the kind of small that you might stare at for 30 seconds, and then dismiss if you were not already in the state she was in which everything she saw was categorized against the baseline she had spent 40 minutes building. She held the reticle on it. The shadow changed again. Something shifted inside it. Not a body. She couldn't confirm a body at this distance in these conditions, but a mass that had mass in a way the surrounding rock did not, that moved with the subtle, involuntary restlessness of a person who had been still for a long time and was making a small instinctive adjustment. The kind of adjustment you make when you've been lying on cold rock for an hour and your hip has gone from uncomfortable to something more serious. She exhaled, held the reticle center on the mass, waited. The mass resolved slightly. The moonlight caught an edge. Could have been equipment, could have been a scope or a radio handset being repositioned. The edge had a different reflectivity than rock, a faint quality that was almost nothing and was enough. She factored the wind. Called it 11 kilometers per hour, northwest, which required a right-to-left hold adjustment of approximately 1 mil at this distance. She made the adjustment, held, the bottom of the exhale. She squeezed. The rifle spoke. At 2,200 meters in the dark, there is no way to confirm a hit by direct observation. You fire, and then you wait for evidence that is never as immediate or as clean as the shooting range teaches you to expect. She kept the scope on target and waited for information. The mass in the shadow was no longer moving with the restlessness of a person managing cold rock, which was not confirmation. It was absence of counter-evidence. She searched the formation, left to right, then right to left, then held on the two most logical secondary positions for a two-person element, one higher, one slightly lateral to the first, both in positions that gave sight lines to the firebase without exposing the observer unnecessarily. Nothing moved. The radio on Channel 3 crackled with Dade's teams confirming they were at Ridgeline Base. She keyed Channel 1. "I have a possible contact at 11 o'clock on the formation, approximately 60 meters right of the highest point. I cannot confirm kill. I have 2 additional search positions that are clear. Advise teams to approach with caution and confirm." Dade's voice came back flat and professional. "Copy. Teams are moving to the formation now. Stand by." She kept the scope on the ridgeline. 7 minutes. Long enough that she started to run through the math again, second-guessing the wind call, second-guessing the distance estimate, second-guessing the target identification at the edge of what the scope could give her in those conditions. She was aware that she was doing this, and she let herself do it because suppressing the doubt did not eliminate it. It just pushed it somewhere less accessible. Her father would have told her something here. She wasn't sure what. He hadn't trained her for this exact situation because this exact situation was outside the range of what he'd imagined she would ever face. He'd trained her to be excellent at a precise thing, and the rest had been circumstance. Channel 3 broke. Dade's team lead, call sign Archer 2, voice tight but controlled. Position confirmed. 2 personnel, 1 down, appears neutralized. Second, a pause. Brief. Second is wounded. Attempting to extract toward the north draw. We are in pursuit. She moved the scope to the north slope of the formation. In the dark and at this distance, she was looking at shadows and degrees of darkness. And she was looking for movement in the north draw that would tell her direction and speed. Archer 2 marked the pursuit direction, she said on Channel 3. Running northeast. He's moving fast, wounded, heading for the low ground. Northeast, away from the firebase, toward the low ground where the mortar teams might be holding. She moved the scope, found the draw, found the shape of the low ground north of the ridgeline, and let her eyes adapt to the new sector the way she'd adapted to the ridgeline. Not searching, learning. There. Movement on the north slope. A figure moving with the particular gait of someone who is hurt but still running. The asymmetric rhythm of an injury that hasn't disabled but has changed the math of every step. Too far. She was looking at approximately 2,600 meters now, and the figure was moving, and she had the wind variable and the moving target variable simultaneously, which multiplied the difficulty in a way that moved this from the edge of feasible into a different category. Archer 2, I have visual on the slope. How far behind are you? 300 meters, closing. 300 meters. The teams were faster. Break off, she said. Let them go to the low ground. If the tubes are there, we want to know where they are. A pause. She could hear Dade listening on Channel 1. Archer 2, hold at ridgeline, Dade said. His call, not hers, which was correct. Copy, holding. The figure on the north slope kept moving. She tracked it with the scope, down the draw, into the low ground. She was watching for where it stopped, watching for the spatial evidence of where the element the observation post was directing was actually located. The figure didn't stop. It kept moving. Through the low ground and up the far slope, north, away from the firebase, away from any grid she'd associated with the fire mission plan. She held the scope on the draw for another 90 seconds. Warwick, she said on Channel 1. Go ahead. There are no tubes in the low ground, or if there were, they've already moved. The wounded element is running north, not to a tube line. He's running to an extract. A pause from Warwick. Assessment? The fire mission plan was contingent on the observation post being active. No observation post, no accurate adjustment, and whoever is running this operation made a contingency decision when the post went quiet. They either aborted or they have a secondary trigger we don't know about yet. She kept the scope on the low ground, still searching. Either way, the mortar threat is reduced, possibly neutralized. Possibly. It's the honest word, sir. Another pause. Longer. Can you track the wounded element? I can watch the slope. I can't track 2,600 meters in these conditions against a moving target. If I shoot, I'm firing at a shadow and a probability. I'm not asking you to shoot, Warwick said. I'm asking if you can watch him long enough to identify an extract point. She turned back to the north slope. The figure had reached the far ridgeline and was gone. Into concealment or over the top. He's out of visual, she said. North ridgeline. Time on target? Oh, 328. Warwick said nothing for a moment. She heard him on a separate line, voice too low to parse. Then, Dade, I need your teams on the ridgeline formation. Secure the confirmed position, recover any equipment, hold for forensics. Copy, Dade said. Mercer, stand down from the platform, command room, 15 minutes. Copy. She lowered the rifle and sat back against the wall of the observation platform. The cold had gone from the peripheral awareness of someone in field conditions to the genuine presence of a temperature that had been pressing on her for 90 minutes and was now making itself known in her hands and her jaw and the muscles of her back. She became aware in the stillness of the moment after that she was shaking slightly, not from cold alone. The particular sustained focus of the last 90 minutes unspooling now that the immediate requirement had passed, the way the body runs a tab during high concentration and presents the bill afterward. She breathed, looked at the ridgeline. She had fired once in the dark, at 2 kilometers, at a target she could not confirm, and then watched the secondary contact run north into the mountains, which meant the outcome of the last 90 minutes was 1 possible neutralization, 1 escaped contact, and a mortar threat that was reduced but not confirmed eliminated. Not clean, not certain. Her father would have said something about that too, though she wasn't sure what. He'd been honest about the parts of precision work that didn't satisfy, the shots you couldn't confirm, the situations where you did everything right and the outcome remained unresolved. The job is the shot, he'd told her once. Everything after the shot is evidence. You don't control evidence, you just collect it. She collected the rifle and went down from the platform. The command room at 0340 had the feel of a space that had been running on urgency and coffee for too many hours. The accumulated weight of people making high-stakes decisions in a small room, making itself present in the quality of the air and the way everyone held their posture, which had gone from operational tension to the sagged, functional alertness of the back end of a long night. Garrett was on his laptop. Solis was on the satellite link with someone Lena didn't recognize. Reyes was in the corner with a cup of something hot, and the expression of a person who has been watching a process unfold and is synthesizing observations the way that is her professional function. Warwick looked at Lena when she came in. His eyes went to the rifle and then came back to her face. Position is confirmed, he said. Archer 2 found 1 KIA and significant equipment at the 11 o'clock position. Spotting scope, encrypted radio. Same authentication suite as the Breck devices. Field notes. They're photographing now. The wounded contact? North of the far ridgeline. We have aerial assets repositioning. Might get something at first light. He didn't sound confident about it. What matters right now is the field notes, Garrett said without looking up from his laptop. The field notes are pre-surveyed fire solutions. 12 specific aim points inside this firebase, pre-calculated with range and deflection. That's not a hasty operation. That's a survey that took time and a previous visit to this area. How previous? Warwick asked. The paper stock, the ink type, the notation system. It looks like it matches documentation from the Breck package. Garrett looked up. Which suggests Breck wasn't the planner. He was the conduit. The planning happened earlier through somebody else's network, and Breck was the local activation mechanism. Warwick sat down. Lena sat too because her legs had made a decision about standing that she didn't argue with. How long has this been running? She said. That's the question, Warwick said. We took Breck off the board 6 hours ago. Somebody activated the secondary plan within those 6 hours, which means there's a communications channel we didn't know about, and it's faster than we thought. Hale? Solis said from the satellite position. We got a hit on the exit corridor. Hale was stopped at a coalition checkpoint at 2100 hours. He claimed routine travel authorization. The checkpoint passed him through because his paperwork was clean. Solis paused. We've since confirmed the travel authorization was falsified. The checkpoint doesn't know where he went after. He activated the secondary plan, Lena said. That's the assessment, Warwick said, which means he had a communication channel to the observation post element that didn't route through Breck. Yes. She looked at the table, 20 years old, still in the phase where he thought everything was temporary. Corporal Dennis Hale, ComSec custodian, Frost Ridge outpost, who had spent time at a logistics hub 400 kilometers south, and had come to Frost Ridge 6 weeks ago with equipment and access, and apparently a plan that predated his arrival. He wasn't recruited here, she said. He came here already recruited. Warwick looked at her. He was placed, she said. The ComSec position at Frost Ridge opened up 6 weeks ago. Whoever is running this network put him in that position because they needed access to the authentication suite, and they needed someone who already understood what to do with it. Which means someone knew the ComSec position would be open, Solis said slowly. The room processed that, Warwick said. The previous ComSec custodian at Frost Ridge rotated out 8 weeks ago. Standard rotation? On paper. He looked at Garrett. I need the previous custodian's assignment history and personnel record. Tonight. Working it, Garrett said. Rhea set down her cup and walked to the table. She had the look of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment and has identified it. This is larger than Frost Ridge, she said. The pass ambush was tactical. The Firebase fire mission was tactical. But if they had pre-placed personnel in a ComSec position 8 weeks ago, that's strategic. That's operational access at a level that takes months of planning and a network with reach into personnel assignment systems. Counterintelligence's problem, Warwick said. Partly, Reyes said, but also relevant to the decision you're going to have to make about Mercer in about 5 hours. Warwick looked at Reyes. Something passed between them. Not the compressed conversation she'd seen between him and Dade, but a different kind of exchange. Acknowledgement of a context she didn't have. What decision? Lena said. Neither of them answered immediately, which was itself an answer of a kind. It was Calloway who spoke, from the doorway where he'd been standing for what turned out to be longer than she'd realized, his coffee forgotten in one hand. The program Reyes runs, he said. She's been evaluating you since she got here. That's not a secret. You knew that. He looked at her steadily. What she needs to tell General Morrison at 0800 is whether you're an asset worth developing or a signal specialist who had an exceptional 48 hours and should go back to maintaining radios. Lena looked at him, then at Reyes. I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to recommend, Reyes said. That's not how this works. But I need you to understand what the 0800 call is actually about before you walk into it. So that I know what questions to answer honestly. So that you know what you're being asked to consider. She sat with that. Outside in the east, the sky was doing the thing mountain skies did before dawn. Not lightning exactly, but changing quality. The darkness becoming slightly less total. The distinction between ridgeline and sky becoming fractionally more legible. She thought about Reyes asking her why she'd stayed in signals. She thought about Warwick's question in the hallway. The same question, essentially, framed differently. She thought about the northeast ridgeline at 2 kilometers, and the shot she couldn't confirm, and the figure running north into the dark toward whatever extraction had been arranged for someone who had spent the night trying to call fire onto a firebase full of people. She thought about the briefing room and the pen she had set down. "I need to ask you something," she said to Reyes. "Go ahead. The program. What does it actually require? Full disclosure of capability? No more hiding the rifle? No more pulling groups wide at qualification. You operate as what you are, not as what's convenient to appear to be." Reyes said it simply. "You'd be trained further. There are gaps in your background because your training was civilian and informal. Even if the precision outcome is comparable, you'd work with teams. You'd be evaluated continuously. You'd have a chain of command that knows what you're capable of, and that expectation would be significant." "And the promise I made." Reyes looked at her without flinching. "That's not my call. That's yours and your mother's." The room was quiet except for Garrett's fingers on his keyboard and the distant sound of the firebase beginning to wake up. The first shift change, the first vehicle check, the accumulated routine of an installation moving from the still of deep night into the business of early morning. Dade appeared in the doorway. "Forensics team is on the ridgeline," he said. "We've got the field notes, the radio, a spotting scope with a data logger. The data logger has observation records going back 3 weeks." He looked at Warwick. "They were watching this firebase for 3 weeks before last night." 3 weeks. Pre-surveyed fire solutions. 12 aim points. Lena thought about all the things that had not happened in those 3 weeks. All the convoys and personnel movements and command meetings that had occurred inside the footprint of a firebase being watched from a ridgeline 2 kilometers out. She thought about Breck filing a route assessment 2 days ago for a convoy that the observation post had been positioned to support weeks before the convoy was even planned. Not a responsive operation, a prepared one. Who else knew the convoy was happening, she asked. Warwick looked at her. "Outside of Frost Ridge," she said, "the convoy was a resupply to Firebase Kesler. Who at Firebase Kesler knew we were coming?" The room went quiet in a different way. Calloway said, "Standard coordination, the Firebase commander, logistics section, the landing zone control officer for the resupply, Ishi Batan Toshogititsitsum. And anyone at this Firebase," Lena said, "who was watching the ridgeline for 3 weeks and positioned a fire control element here in the same planning cycle as the Raven Pass ambush." She stopped. Warwick had gone very still. "The observation post wasn't contingency," she said. "It wasn't activated after the pass. The field notes go back 3 weeks. The Firebase fire mission plan and the convoy ambush were planned simultaneously, as a single operation." Garrett looked up from his laptop. "Two-phase," Warwick said quietly. "Take the convoy in the pass, then hit the Firebase response when it consolidates here." He looked at Dade. "If the pass ambush had succeeded, we'd have had casualties evacuated here," Dade said. "Command consolidation here. Personnel concentration here." He looked at the table. "And 12 pre-surveyed fire positions with a competent observation post would have hit us at our most concentrated moment." The room sat with what that was. Warwick stood up. He looked at Lena with an expression that was harder to read than anything she'd seen from him in the last 14 hours. Not the investigative attention, not the professional assessment, but something that had the quality of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already measured correctly. "You've been thinking like an operator since before I walked in the door," he said. She didn't answer. "That's not a compliment or a criticism," he said. "It's an observation that I'm going to include in my report." He picked up his notepad. "The 0800 call is in 4 hours. Get some sleep if you can." She stood. The rifle was still leaning against the table where she'd set it when she came in. She reached for it. "Leave it," Warwick said. She looked at him. "You'll get it back before the debrief," he said. "I need it logged for the next 4 hours." She let go, walked to the door. "Mercer." Reyes's voice, quiet. She turned. The The shot tonight, Reyes said. At 2,200 meters in the dark, on a target you couldn't fully confirm, with a wind variable and no range data from the actual position. She held Lena's gaze. Most people with your skill set would not have taken that shot. I know, Lena said. Why did you? She thought about the 12 pre-surveyed fire positions, the 3 weeks of observation records on the data logger, the 2-phase operation that had been planned to hit a convoy and a pass and then hit a firebase full of people when they consolidated. Because the alternative, she said, was waiting to find out I was wrong to hold. She went back to the east block and lay down and did not sleep, but her breathing eventually slowed and the shaking in her hands stopped, and the sky outside the small window went from the deep black of 3 in the morning to the gray of a mountain dawn coming in cold and flat and without ceremony. The same as it had every morning she had been at altitude. And somewhere on a ridgeline 2 kilometers to the northeast, Dade's teams were moving through a position that had been watching this firebase for 3 weeks, collecting field notes and encrypted radios and the documented evidence of an operation that had been built around the assumption that nobody would see it coming. The assumption had been almost right. The gray came in through the east block window the way it always did at altitude. Without warmth, without transition, just the gradual replacement of one kind of dark with another. Lena lay on her back and watched it happen and did not sleep, but at some point her body had made a separate peace with the night without telling her mind. Because when Garrett knocked at 07:15, she felt, not rested, but functional in a way that was distinct from the ragged alertness of 03:30. Debrief in 45, he said through the door. Reyes says eat something first. She ate something. Toast and coffee from the mess facility, standing at the counter because sitting felt like a commitment she wasn't ready to make. Torres was at a table across the room and lifted his chin when she came in. The minimal acknowledgement of someone who understood that the situation did not call for conversation. She appreciated that about him more than she could have said at that particular moment. At 7:58, she walked into the command room. The satellite link was already live. General Morrison's staff occupied 3 windows on Solis's laptop. Colonel Brandt in the center frame, 2 other senior personnel she didn't have names for flanking him. On the Firebase Kesler side, Warwick, Reyes, Calloway, Dade, Garrett, and Lena, who sat at the end of the table closest to the door because that was where a chair had been left open and because the instinct of 7 months died slowly. Brandt opened without ceremony. Specialist Mercer. I've read Captain Calloway's engagement report, Warwick's preliminary findings, and Dr. Reyes's initial assessment. I've also reviewed the forensic package from the Northeast Ridgeline. I have questions, and I want straight answers, not the polished version. Yes, sir. Your shot last night, 2,200 meters, 0 confirmed illumination, moving element at an unconfirmed position. Warwick's report says you took the shot based on shadow contrast and target mass identification. Walk me through the decision. She did. Not the version edited for confidence, not the version that minimized the uncertainty. She told him what she'd seen, what she'd factored, what she hadn't been able to confirm, and why she'd fired anyway. She told him about the 12 pre-surveyed fire positions and the 3-week observation record, and the calculation she'd made that the cost of being wrong about the shot was lower than the cost of holding until she had better information. Brandt listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You made a judgment call at the edge of your confirmed capability, based on a threat assessment you developed independently from the operational picture available to everyone else in that room." "Yes, sir. That's not a criticism," he said. "I'm characterizing it accurately so we all understand what we're talking about." He shifted in his frame. The KIA on the ridgeline has been identified. His prints matched a database record from a separate operation 18 months ago in a different region. He was not a local actor. He was a professional, trained, placed, and resourced by a network that has been running operations against coalition installations for considerably longer than the Frost Ridge and Firebase Kesler incidents. The room was quiet. Breck is talking, Brandt continued. Partially. He's negotiating, which means he's trading information for considerations I'm not going to discuss in this format. What he's given us so far confirms the 2-phase assessment. The pass ambush and the Firebase fire mission were planned together, with a contingency trigger through Hale's separate channel. The original ComSec custodian at Frost Ridge was not randomly rotated. He was pressured out through a personnel complaint that Warwick's team is now treating as manufactured. Calloway said, Breck filed that complaint. Correct, Brandt said, which gave them a vacancy they could fill. Lena thought about Hale. 20 years old. She thought about how you get a 20-year-old to do a thing like that. She thought about what has to be in place before someone is willing to sit in a TOC at 04:47 in the morning and transmit a convoy's route and timing to people who intend to kill that convoy. She didn't ask. It wasn't her question to ask in this room. Hale, Warwick said. Any update? He crossed into an area where our tracking capability degrades. We have partners working it. Brandt's tone was flat on that. He may surface. He may not. Another silence. Mercer. Brandt's attention came back to her with the specific directness of someone who has been building to something. In the 48 hours since the Raven Pass engagement, you have contributed materially to the disruption of a two-phase operation that would, at minimum, have resulted in significant coalition casualties and, at maximum, have achieved a level of operational damage that would have required months to recover from. He paused. You did this while under investigation by Captain Warwick as a potential subject, while operating with equipment you've been concealing for 5 years, and in conditions that no reasonable assessment of your documented capabilities would have predicted you capable of. She didn't respond. He wasn't asking a question yet. I'm going to ask you something directly, he said, and I want the honest answer, not the career-safe answer. Sir? The briefing room. When you saw the terrain overlay and recognized the past geometry, what would you have needed in order to speak up? The room was very still. She thought about it. The real answer, not the one that sounded like the right kind of accountability. Permission, she said. Not formal permission. I wasn't waiting for someone to call on me. I mean an internal sense that my read was worth the cost of what revealing it would expose. She paused. I didn't have that. I'd spent 5 years building a version of myself that didn't take up space, and in that room the version of me that takes up space was the version I'd been hiding. I couldn't access one without the other. Brandt was quiet for a moment. That's an honest answer, he said. It's the one you asked for. And now? 48 hours later, after everything you've done in those 48 hours, do you have it? She thought about the observation platform, the shot at 2,200 meters at a target she couldn't confirm, the conversation with Reyes at 0400 in a command room, the briefing room, which she was not finished with and didn't expect to finish with soon. I'm closer to it than I was, she said. That's also honest. He shifted. Dr. Reyes has submitted her preliminary assessment. I'm not going to read it to you because it belongs to the evaluation process, and that process has steps that haven't happened yet. What I will tell you is that it recommends further evaluation, which means it is not a no. He looked at the camera directly. What it means in practical terms is that you are not going back to Frost Ridge. She heard that land in herself, felt the specific quality of it. The investigation, she started, Warwick has cleared you as a subject. The investigation found no evidence of involvement in the Hale-Breck network, and the timeline of your morning on the day of the convoy is corroborated by radio logs and Yates's after-action statement. Brandt said it matter-of-factly. You were never a serious suspect. Warwick will tell you the same thing. She looked at Warwick. You were always at the edge of the field, he said. Not in it. I needed to confirm that, and I confirmed it. You could have told me that, she said. I could have, he agreed. I didn't, because the investigation was still open. That's how investigations work. She thought about the 48 hours of knowing that someone in that room was measuring her as a possibility. She decided she wasn't going to be angry about it because anger required energy she didn't have, and because he was right that it was procedure and procedures existed for reasons. She was also, she admitted privately, a little angry about it. She filed that away. What does not going back to Frost Ridge mean? She asked. Brandt said, It means you stay at Firebase Kesler pending formal evaluation. Reyes will run the process. It takes between 5 and 10 days. At the end of that process, a recommendation goes to my desk. If I approve it, you enter a specialized training pipeline. If I don't, you're reassigned to a signals position at a different installation, and none of this is in your personnel file in a way that harms your service record. And if I decline the evaluation, same outcome. Reassignment, clean record. She looked at the camera, looked at Brant's face in the center window, which had the quality of a person who had made many of these offers and knew that the ones worth making were the ones where the answer wasn't obvious. I have to make a phone call first, she said. A pause. The evaluation doesn't start until tomorrow morning, Brant said. You have tonight. She borrowed Calloway's satellite phone because hers was in the equipment cage at Frost Ridge, and he offered without her asking, which she thought was the clearest indication of how the 48 hours had changed the geometry between them. She made the call from the same low concrete barrier where Solus had sat down across from her 2 evenings ago. The mountains were doing what they did in morning light, throwing everything into sharp relief, the shadows crisp, the rock faces bright where they caught the sun, and absolutely dark where they didn't. The phone rang 4 times. Her mother picked up on the 5th. Lena. Not a question. Her mother had always answered this way, as if the identity of the caller was already known, already accounted for. Hi, Mom. A pause. Her mother was a woman who used pauses the way other people used words, to indicate that something was being thought about rather than to fill space. You sound different, her mother said. I am different, she said. Something happened. Are you hurt? No, I'm fine. She stopped. I need to tell you about the last 2 days. She told her. Not the classified details. She understood what she could and couldn't say on a satellite phone from a forward Firebase, but the shape of it, the convoy, the pass, the rifle, the promise. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was her nature. When Lena stopped, the silence lasted long enough that she checked the signal indicator to confirm the connection was still live. Mom, I'm here. I'm thinking. Another 10 seconds. You're calling because they want you to do more of it, her mother said. Yes. And you want to know if I'm going to be angry? Lena looked at the mountains. I want to know if I should be. Her mother made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Lena, I asked you to make that promise because I was standing next to your father's casket in the rain, and I was scared of losing you the same way I'd been scared of losing him every day for 20 years, just without the actual danger. He was a civilian. He shot targets on ranges, and I was still scared. A pause. I didn't actually think you'd be in situations where it mattered. I know. I should have thought about it more carefully. Mom, no, I should have. I was scared and I asked you for something that I shouldn't have had the right to ask for. Her voice was steady. Not without emotion. Her mother was never without emotion. But steady the way people get when they've moved through something while you were on the phone, not interrupting them. Did anyone... She stopped. Started again. The people on the convoy, they came home? Yes. Another silence. Different quality. Then I'm not angry, her mother said quietly. I'm scared, which is different. I know the difference. I know you do. A pause. What do you want to do? It was such a clean question, the kind of question that cut through everything accumulated in the last 48 hours. The debrief, Warwick's investigation, Reyes's evaluation, Brant's offer, and asked the thing underneath all of it. I think I want to stop hiding, Lena said. Her mother didn't answer immediately. Your father would have... She stopped. No, I'm not going to do that. He's not here. This is you and me. A breath. If you want to stop hiding, Lena, then stop hiding. I'll be scared. I'll probably call you too much, but I'm not going to ask you to make a promise you'll have to break the next time someone needs you. Lena closed her eyes for a moment. I'm sorry I broke the first one without telling you. You told me now, her mother said. That counts. The formal evaluation didn't begin until the following morning, but Reyes found her that afternoon in the mess facility and sat across from her with coffee and the directness of someone who didn't believe in warming up to things. Before tomorrow, Reyes said, I want to tell you how this actually works, not the version in the briefing. All right. The evaluation isn't primarily about confirming your shooting capability. Brant's read my preliminary report, Calloway's report, Warwick's report. The capability is documented. What the evaluation is about is understanding how you think and whether how you think is compatible with the way this program operates. She set her cup down. The program puts people in situations where they have significant autonomy, significant consequence, and incomplete information. The question isn't whether you can perform under those conditions. You've demonstrated that. The question is whether you understand what you're doing when you perform under those conditions and whether that understanding is stable. Bond shushis. Versus what? Versus being exceptional in crisis and undependable in the space between crises. Reyes looked at her steadily. Some people with your capability profile are excellent in the acute moment and very difficult in the sustained professional context. They don't operate well within structure. They don't communicate what they know until they've decided to, which creates gaps that organizations can't absorb. Lena held her gaze. You're describing the briefing room. I'm describing a pattern that the briefing room is one data point of. It's also the 7 months of invisibility. It's also taking the shot at 2,200 meters without confirming the decision with Warwick first. Warwick gave me channel access. He told you to use the platform, Reyes said. He didn't tell you to take a shot at the edge of your confirmed range and field conditions at a target you couldn't confirm. You made that call independently. She paused. I'm not saying it was wrong. The field notes on the ridgeline confirmed there was a fire control element there. You were right. But the decision architecture? I know, Lena said. Tell me. I made the call without full authorization because the timeline didn't allow for a consultation cycle, and I assessed the cost of the miss as lower than the cost of holding, which is the same assessment I didn't make in the briefing room, in the opposite direction. Do you see the pattern? I make unilateral calls in one direction or the other. I either hold everything or I release everything. Yes. And the program needs something in the middle. The program needs someone who can communicate what they're thinking in real time instead of after the fact. Reyes picked up her cup. You sat in a briefing room with critical terrain analysis in your head and said nothing. 40 hours later, you fired at 2,200 meters in the dark without confirming with your command. Both of those are the same underlying behavior in different directions. The question the evaluation is trying to answer is whether you can develop the middle space. Lena sat with that. It was the most uncomfortable thing anyone had said to her in the last 2 days, which was a high bar. My father called it the shot before the shot, she said. What does that mean? The decision to fire is made before you touch the trigger. By the time you're in position, the decision should already be complete. He meant it about precision shooting, but... She stopped. He probably meant it more broadly. Did he teach you how to make that decision correctly? He taught me how to make it precisely. I'm not sure those are the same thing. Reyes looked at her for a moment. That's the most self-aware thing you've said since I've been watching you. Is that good? It's a starting point. Warwick found her that evening near the vehicle lot, which had been cleared of the forensics equipment and returned to the ordinary function of a vehicle lot. He had his notepad in one hand, but he wasn't looking at it. One thing I didn't put in the report, he said. She looked at him. I've been doing this for 9 years, he said. Counterintelligence. I've worked with a lot of people in a lot of situations, and I've developed... He paused, considering the word. A particular discomfort with people who are too clean, too consistent, who answer questions the way questions are supposed to be answered. He looked at the mountains. You answer questions the way you actually think, which sometimes means the answer is slow or incomplete or uncomfortable. That's harder to work with in the short term. And the long term? Better, he said. Significantly. She looked at him. Was that a compliment? It was an observation. You do that a lot. I've been told. He looked down at the notepad. Hail. We got a signal. He made a transmission from a location approximately 80 kilometers northeast of here at 0400 this morning. The transmission was intercepted. We're working the location. Will you find him? Probably not immediately. People who are running with this kind of network support don't stay findable long. He said it without frustration, which she interpreted as something he'd made his peace with a long time ago. But the network is compromised. Breck is talking. The Hail channel is burned. Whoever is running this operation lost their local access capability in 48 hours. That matters even if Hail specifically isn't recoverable. Because of the pass, she said, and the ridgeline. Because of you, yes. He said it directly, without the qualifier she'd half expected. Not exclusively, but centrally. She didn't know what to do with that. She looked at the vehicle lot. The convoys, she said. Going forward, the Raven Pass route, closed for reassessment. Callaway has issued a standing order that all route recommendations require dual source verification and independent terrain analysis. He paused. He wrote that into the order himself, within about 2 hours of the Breck arrest. Good. He also put something in his commendation recommendation that I thought you should know about. She looked at him. He wrote that the engagement at Raven Pass should be reviewed as a case study in the cost of personnel self-concealment, Warwick said. His argument was that the military's culture of credentials over demonstrated capability creates conditions where people with relevant skills stay invisible because there's no permission structure for them to be visible. He put the notepad away. He's recommending a policy review. He put which is Callaway filing a bureaucratic action because he can't actually think of anything else to do with what happened, which is a very Callaway response. Lena thought about the commendation and the policy review and the 48 hours that had generated both of them. She thought about Yates in the vehicle lot saying he'd spent his whole life at the wrong place at the right time, and today felt different. She thought about Torres asking how she was doing and accepting an honest answer. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "The investigation. Warwick, when you were running the field and I knew I was on it, was there a point where you thought I'd actually done it?" He looked at her. "The first 4 hours," he said. "Yes." "What changed?" "The Ridgeline observation post record, 3 weeks of surveillance data, the Breck route recommendation, the hail placement at ComSec." He paused. "And you? The way you thought through the 2-phase assessment in real time in that room. People who are running a network don't help you understand the network while the investigation is active. They deflect or they cooperate in ways that make them look cooperative. You were doing something different." "What was I doing?" "Thinking," he said, out loud, without calculating first what it would look like. He picked up his notepad. "That's hard to fake for 48 hours. He walked away. She stood in the vehicle lot until the cold made staying impractical, and then she went back inside. The debrief with General Morrison happened the following morning via satellite, and it ran for 90 minutes, and when it was done, Lena sat outside the command building on the same concrete barrier and felt a particular kind of exhaustion that was less physical than structural. The exhaustion of having had 7 months of concealment unwound in 48 hours and 100 hours of operational intensity, and arriving on the other side of it with nothing hidden that used to be hidden and not yet knowing what it felt like to live that way. Callaway came out after 20 minutes and sat down across from her the way Solis had 2 days ago. Different posture, different quality of silence. "Morrison approved the evaluation," he said. "I know, I was there." "I know you were there." He looked at his coffee cup. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you since the pass. I've gone through about 6 versions. You don't have to say anything. I know, I'm going to anyway." He looked up. "In that briefing room, I ran the route analysis through Breck because I trusted his professional expertise in fire support assessment. He had access to terrain factors I didn't have. That's standard procedure. It was also exactly what someone running Breck would have counted on." He paused. "If you had spoken up in that room, I don't know what I would have done. I would have listened. I think I would have pushed back and then probably run it by Breck anyway to validate the concern, which means Breck would have known someone read the terrain and he might have adjusted the plan." She looked at him. "That might have made it worse," she said. "I don't know," he said. "That's the honest answer. I don't know. Which is why I'm not going to tell you that you should have spoken up in the briefing room as if that's simple. It's not simple." He held the coffee cup with both hands. "What I'll tell you is that I should have created an environment where you could speak up if you had something to say. That's on me. A signals specialist with 7 months at an outpost shouldn't feel like the room doesn't have space for her assessment." She thought about that. "Would you have?" she said. "Before the pass. If I'd said something, would you have listened?" He was quiet for a moment, the honest kind of quiet. "I like to think so," he said. "I'm not certain." "That's the honest answer." "Yeah," he said. "It is." They sat with that for a moment. The sky above Firebase Kesler was doing the mountain morning thing, high and blue and uninvested in the proceedings below it, the same sky it had been every morning. "The commendation recommendation," she said, "and the policy review. I had to do something with what happened," he said. Paperwork is what I'm authorized to generate. She almost smiled, didn't quite get there. The team, he said. Yates, Torres, the others from the convoy. They want to see you before you start the evaluation. Not a formal thing, just... He gestured vaguely. What soldiers do. She thought about that. I'd like that, she said. He stood, looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has revised an assessment significantly and is still integrating the revised version. For what it's worth, he said, I've put a lot of people in for commendations. Most of them are for doing their jobs well under pressure. He paused. What you did in the past was different, and the ridgeline was different again. And what you figured out in that command room about the two-phase structure, he stopped. I'm not sure I have the right language for what that was. You don't have to, she said. No, he agreed, but I wanted to try. He went back inside. She sat on the concrete barrier and looked at the mountains, which had been watching all of this with their characteristic indifference, and which would continue to watch after the evaluation was done and the recommendation was filed and whatever came next came. She thought about her father at a kitchen table with graph paper and a cold cup of coffee. She thought about her mother's voice on the satellite phone saying, I'm scared, which is different. She thought about the briefing room and the pen she had set down, which she was not finished with and might not be for a long time, and which she was beginning to think was supposed to stay with her, not as weight, but as calibration. The thing you carry not to punish yourself, but to remember the specific cost of staying invisible when you have something to say. The rifle case was back in her room. Warwick had returned it without ceremony that morning, setting it by the door of the command room and saying nothing about it, which she appreciated. She was not the person she'd been at 1900 hours 2 days ago in a briefing room in the back row. She was not yet certain what person she was instead. That uncertainty, she thought, was probably the correct thing to be carrying right now. More honest than the alternative. More useful than the 5 years of careful concealment that had gotten her to a briefing room where she'd known something critical and held it until the moment it had almost cost 25 people everything. Torres came out of the east block and walked toward the mess facility and stopped when he saw her. Evaluations tomorrow? He said. Yes. How do you feel about it? She thought about the real answer. Like someone who's been holding their breath for 5 years, she said, and is trying to figure out how to just breathe normally. He considered that. Sounds about right, he said. He went to breakfast. She sat on the concrete barrier a little longer, and the mountains held their position, and the sky was the same sky, and she was not the same person, and that was the only thing she knew with certainty about what came next. The evaluation began the following morning at 800 in a room Reyes had requisitioned from the Firebase's training section. Small, functional, a table and 4 chairs, and a whiteboard that someone had never fully erased, the ghost of a previous briefing still visible in the upper right corner. Lena sat across from Reyes and a man named Hendricks, who had arrived on the morning flight from Bagram and introduced himself as a program assessor with the specific economy of someone who believed titles were administrative details and behavior was the actual data. Hendricks was maybe 50. He had the hands of someone who had spent a lot of time in field conditions and the eyes of someone who had spent an equal amount of time evaluating other people in those conditions. He looked at her the way Reyes looked at her, not as a subject to be impressed or a candidate to be managed, but as a system to be understood. We're going to run this over 5 days, Reyes said. Not all of it is shooting. Most of it isn't. You should know that up front. You told me, Lena said. I told you the general version. I'm telling you the specific version now. Reyes opened a folder. Day 1 is this. Conversation. We're going to talk about how you think, and you're going to be honest about it, which, based on the last 3 days, I believe you're capable of. She looked up. Day 2 is written assessment, scenario analysis, threat modeling, decision documentation. Day 3 is field observation. Day 4 is a practical exercise I'm not going to describe yet. Day 5 is synthesis. And the shooting, Day 3 includes a confirmed range session, controlled conditions, documented results. She paused. That part is administrative. The capability is already on record. Hendricks said, Tell me about the worst call you've made in the last 3 days. She looked at him. Not the best call. The worst. The briefing room, she said. Walk me through it. Me through. She did. She had walked through it multiple times now, for Brant, for Warwick, for Calloway. And each time the walkthrough had been slightly different because each conversation had opened a new angle on it. This one was the most uncomfortable version because Hendricks asked questions in the pauses that targeted the specific spots she'd glossed over in previous tellings. "You said you were concerned about being wrong," he said at one point, "and concerned about exposure. Which concern was larger?" She stopped. "Exposure," she said. "You were more afraid of revealing what you could do than you were of the possibility that people would die if you were right." She felt that land in the specific way that accurate things land when you haven't said them plainly to yourself yet. "Yes," she said. "That's important," Hendricks said, "not as a condemnation, as a data point about your decision architecture under that specific type of pressure." He made a note. "What type of pressure is that specifically?" "Social," she said. "The pressure of being seen as something I hadn't authorized anyone to see me as." "And in the past? On the platform last night? Those were different pressures. Physical, tactical. The cost of the wrong call was external. Other people, immediate, concrete. So you perform better when the cost of the wrong call is concrete and external than when it's social and internal." She looked at him. "Most people do," he said. "But most people aren't being evaluated for a program that requires them to operate in both conditions simultaneously." She understood what he was telling her without him stating it as a requirement. She filed it. "What would it take," Reyes said, "for the social cost to feel as concrete as the tactical cost?" She thought about it honestly, which took a moment. "Practice," she said, "at having people see me and not having the world end." Reyes wrote something. Hendricks did not, which he was learning meant he had already placed the information somewhere in his assessment. "All right," Reyes said, "let's keep going." They kept going for 4 hours. The 5 days had a texture she hadn't expected. Not grueling. She had expected grueling, had prepared herself for the particular endurance of sustained high-stakes performance. What she got instead was something more like sustained honesty, which turned out to be its own form of endurance. The written scenarios on day 2 asked her to document her decision process in real time, which meant catching herself in the act of making choices and writing down the actual reasoning rather than the post hoc version that made the choice look better than it had felt. She was bad at this initially. She kept writing the clean version and then catching herself and scratching it out and starting again. Reyes reviewed the first scenario, read it, put it down. "This is what you think I want to read," she said. "I know," Lena said. "I caught it about halfway through." "The second half is better." She pushed it back. "Do the rest from the second half." She did. The rest was slower and less organized and more accurate. The range session on day 3 lasted 90 minutes. Confirmed positions, measured distances, logged results. She shot at 800, 1200, 1500, and 1800 meters in conditions that were controlled relative to the pass and the observation platform and felt almost casual because of it. Hendricks stood behind the spotting scope and said nothing during the session and nothing after, which told her the results were not a surprise to him. What he did say, as they walked back from the range, was, "Your father taught you to shoot slow." Yes. Most precision shooters learn fast and have to relearn slow. You started slow. He said the fundamentals degraded when you rushed them, and it was easier to build speed on a solid foundation than to rebuild a foundation after you'd been fast. Smart man. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was the first time in 5 days she'd said it without the weight of 5 years pushing down on the word, he was. Hendricks looked at her sideways as they walked. "When did you last talk about him without it costing you something?" She thought about it. "My mother," she said. "On the phone 2 nights ago." She paused. "That's the most recent version that didn't cost something." "What changed?" "I told her about the pass first, which meant I was telling her about what he'd given me before I was telling her I'd broken the promise. The gift before the debt. Something like that." He didn't say anything else about it. He didn't need to. Day 4's practical exercise was not what she'd expected, which she suspected was the point. Reyes brought in 3 other people, 2 men and a woman, none of whom she'd seen before, introduced only by first names, and put all 4 of them in a scenario that required collaborative decision-making under time pressure and incomplete information. Not a shooting problem, a planning problem. A targeting package with conflicting intelligence, a compressed timeline, and a command element that kept changing the parameters. The other three were clearly experienced. They moved through the problem efficiently and with the confidence of people who had done this type of work before and trusted their own process. She was slower, not because she didn't understand the problem. She understood it quickly, probably more quickly than she appeared to. She was slower because she was trying to do the thing Reyes and Hendricks had been pointing at all week, which was to say the thing she was thinking while she was thinking it, and not hold it until she'd decided it was worth saying. It felt like speaking a language at conversation speed that she'd only ever studied from books. At one point, she said something about the targeting geometry that stopped the other three mid-discussion. The woman named Kara looked at her. "Say that again," Kara said. She said it again. Kara looked at the two men. "She's right." "I know," one of the men said. He had the specific tone of someone who had reached the same conclusion 3 seconds earlier and was now integrating the fact that someone else had gotten there first by a different route. They adjusted the package. The exercise ended. Reyes and Hendricks debriefed it in a separate room. When Reyes came back in, she sat across from Lena and said, "What were you doing differently today than you were doing on day one?" "Talking before I was certain." "How did that feel?" "Like being cold," she said. "Uncomfortable in a way that's manageable, but that you're aware of the whole time." "The other three, did they notice you were working at it?" "Probably. Kara did. She's watching people the same way you are." "Kara is also in the program," Reyes said. "She's 18 months in." A pause. "She said after the session that she wished she'd had your terrain read when she was starting out. For what that's worth." "It was worth something." Lena let it be worth something without diminishing it. On the morning of day 5, before the synthesis session, Warwick found her at the mess facility. He had news in his posture before he said anything. The particular set of his shoulders that she'd learned over the last week meant he was carrying something he'd decided to deliver in person. "Hale," he said. She set down her coffee. Coalition partners picked him up at a border crossing 400 kilometers north, 16 hours ago. He sat down across from her. He had documentation that was good enough to almost work. Almost. What happened? A border officer who'd been briefed on the alert flagged the documentation anomaly. Small thing. The paper stock of the travel authorization didn't match the issued format. The officer had been shown the difference in a training 2 weeks ago. He paused. Random training. Standard procedure. Nothing special. She thought about that. The random chain of small competencies that had closed the net. "He's in custody?" "He's in custody. Being transported." Warwick folded his hands on the table. "He'll talk eventually. People in his situation always do the math on what talking gets them versus what staying quiet gets them, and the math usually resolves in favor of talking within 72 hours. Will it matter? By the time he talks, the network is already restructuring. It always is." He said it without bitterness. But the Frost Ridge and Firebase Kesler operational capability is gone. The authentication suite has been rotated and the rotation cadence is being changed. The ComSec custodian placement pipeline, however they ran it, is burned. Breck is giving us names that are generating separate investigations. He looked at her. What happened in those last 10 days created a damage assessment for that network that they won't recover from quickly. She thought about the briefing room again, the pen she had set down, the 48 hours that had started from that. "Breck," she said, "formally charged, coordinating with federal prosecutors now. He'll be in front of a court-martial within 6 months." Warwick's voice was level. "He'll spend a significant portion of the rest of his life in a federal correctional facility. That's a near certainty based on what he's already admitted." She sat with that. Not satisfaction, exactly. The word for what she felt was closer to completion, the sense of an open equation finally resolving to a number, even if the number was not a good one. "The previous ComSec custodian," she said, "the one who was pressured out, cleared. The complaint against him has been withdrawn from his record. He's being offered reassignment at his choice of installation." Warwick paused. "He's choosing to separate instead. The Army has that effect on some people after something like that." "Can you blame him?" "No. Warwick said simply. They sat in silence for a moment. The evaluation ends today, she said. I know. Are you going to know the result before I do? He looked at her. Probably. Reyes briefs upward before she briefs the candidate. It's procedure. And? He looked at his coffee. You know I'm not going to tell you that, he said. I know. I asked anyway. He almost smiled. She was getting better at reading the almost smiles. You'll know by this afternoon, he said. Whatever it is. He stood to leave, paused. The shot at 2,200 meters, he said. I've been thinking about it. Not the tactical outcome, the decision. He looked at her. You said you fired because the cost of holding was higher than the cost of missing, but I don't think that was the whole reason. She looked at him. I think you fired because somewhere in the last 48 hours you'd made a decision about who you were going to be, he said, and that person didn't hold at 2,200 meters in the dark when there were 12 pre-surveyed fire positions and a firebase full of people. She didn't answer. That's not a criticism, he said. I just wanted to name it. He left. She sat with her coffee until it was cold. What? The synthesis session lasted 2 hours and covered ground she had already covered in pieces across the 5 days, now assembled into a complete picture that Reyes and Hendricks walked her through with the deliberate thoroughness of people who believed candidates deserved to understand their own assessment. When they were finished, Hendricks closed his folder. Questions? He said. 1, she said. The decision architecture problem. The social cost versus the tactical cost. Is that fixable? Fixable is the wrong frame, Hendricks said. It's not a defect. It's a pattern that developed under specific conditions over a long time. It can be reoriented with the right environment and the right practice. He paused. The program provides both. If I'm in it. If you're in it, he agreed, without inflection. Reyes said, We're going to step out for 30 minutes. When we come back, we'll have the recommendation. They left. She sat alone in the room for 30 minutes with the ghost briefing on the whiteboard and the sound of the firebase operating outside the window. Vehicles, voices, the rhythm of a place that continued regardless of what was being decided inside a small room within it. She thought about the 5 days, about the things they had found, the patterns Reyes and Hendricks had named the social cost problem, the binary between holding everything and releasing everything, the capability that had been trained to precision and then buried for 5 years underneath a promise and a version of herself she had constructed to avoid being seen. She thought about whether she wanted this. Not the professional question. The professional question had been answered the moment Brandt said the word evaluation, and she hadn't hesitated. The real question. Whether she was ready to be a person who took up space in rooms, who said the thing she was thinking while she was still thinking it, who operated in the open instead of from behind 7 months of careful invisibility. She thought about the briefing room. Always the briefing room. She thought about the pen she had set down. She thought about 25 people who had come home. Reyes and Hendricks came back in. They sat down. Reyes had a folder closed in front of her, which she didn't open. The recommendation, Reyes said, is approval for program entry. Lena held still. With the following noted conditions, Reyes continued, supplementary training in collaborative decision communication, the process of externalizing your assessment in real time rather than after, 12 months of structured mentorship with a senior program member, and a formal review at 6 months to assess integration. She looked up. The conditions aren't punitive. They're the specific gaps between where you are and where the program needs you to be. I understand. Brandt has already been briefed. He's approved the recommendation. Orders will be cut in the next 48 hours. Reyes paused. You'll have 2 weeks before reporting. Time to handle personal affairs, contact family, do whatever you need to do. She thought about her mother, about the phone calls she would make, about the scared not angry distinction her mother had made, which was probably the most honest thing anyone had said to her across all of it. The training pipeline, she said. Where does it start? Stateside, Fort Liberty. 8 weeks of program orientation before you go operational. Reyes looked at her steadily. It's going to be different from what you're used to. Different how? You're going to be visible, Reyes said, consistently, by design. There is no back row in this program. There's no signals cage to disappear into when a briefing is running. She said it without apology. That's the job. Lena looked at her. I know, she said. Hendrik spoke for the last time. One thing, he said, for whatever it's worth from someone who's been doing this a long time. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across 5 days. Not evaluating anymore, something past that. What you did in the past and on that platform wasn't exceptional because of the marksmanship. Plenty of people in this program can shoot. It was exceptional because you had been invisible for 5 years, and you chose, under the worst possible conditions, under time pressure and threat, and the weight of a promise you'd made over a grave, to be visible. He paused. Most people can't make that choice once. You made it twice in 18 hours. She didn't know what to say to that. She said, I had a good teacher. Hendricks looked at her. Your father? My father, she said. And the 48 hours. He nodded once, closed his folder, and stood. She found Torres by the vehicles that afternoon. He was running a pre-operation check on a HMM UV with the unhurried focus of a man who finds maintenance genuinely satisfying, which was a thing she had known about him for 7 months and appreciated more now than she had before. She told him about the recommendation. He set down the dipstick and wiped his hands on a rag without looking at her. Fort Liberty, he said. 8 weeks of orientation, then operational. What does operational look like? I don't know yet, she said. I'll know more at Fort Liberty. He nodded. Looked at the rag in his hands. Torres is staying in signals, he said. For the record, I figured, if I'd known what was in that bag of yours 7 months ago, he stopped. I don't know what I would have done with it. Probably the same thing everyone else would have, she said. Nothing, because there was nothing to do with it at Frost Ridge. There was yesterday, he said, and the day before. She looked at him. You saved the convoy, he said. Then you saved the Firebase. That's what happened. Everything else is the investigation, the evaluation, all of it. That's the institutional version of what happened. The actual version is 2 conversations, both of which you weren't going to walk away from letting people die. She felt that land, not as a compliment, as a description, which was more useful. I still should have spoken up in the briefing room, she said. Yeah, he said. You should have. He went back to the dipstick. So next time, you'll speak up in the briefing room. She almost said it wasn't that simple. Then she thought about it and decided he wasn't wrong, even if it also wasn't that simple. Yates is somewhere around here, Torres said. He's been telling the story to anyone who'll listen. The past, the platform, all of it. You might want to know that before you run into him. How accurate is the version he's telling? About 70%. He's added some details that improve the drama. What kind of details? You single-handedly cleared the ridgeline before breakfast and did it without breaking a sweat. She looked at him. You did break a sweat, he said. I was there. I was shaking after, she said. My hands were shaking. I know, I saw. He put the dipstick back. That's the 30% he leaves out. He looked at her. I think the shaking matters. I think the shaking is the part that means you're actually human and not just excellent. She thought about that for a moment. Tell him to keep the 70%, she said. The other 30 he can have too if he wants it. Torres looked at her. Yeah? The shaking is part of it, she said. It's not a secret. But she called her mother from the satellite phone that evening with the mountains going orange in the west and the Firebase settling into its end-of-day rhythms. Her mother answered on the 3rd ring. Lena. They approved the evaluation, she said. I'm in. A long pause. Not the thinking kind, the absorbing kind. Are you scared? Her mother asked. She thought about the honest answer. Not the way I thought I'd be, she said. I thought I'd be scared of the work. I'm not. The work I know how to do. She looked at the mountains. I'm scared of being the person who does it openly, for real, not on a ridge in an emergency where there was no other choice. You've been that person twice now, her mother said, in emergencies. Lena. Her mother's voice was quiet and direct. The first time you do something, it doesn't matter that it was an emergency. The second time, it doesn't matter either. After enough times, it just becomes the thing you do. A pause. Your father was like that. He was terrible at being afraid of things he'd already done once. She thought about her father at the range, the way he'd been afraid of exactly nothing that existed in his area of expertise because he'd spent so many years building that expertise that there was no room left in it for fear. "I'm not him," she said. "No," her mother agreed. "You're better at the things he didn't do well." "What didn't he do well?" "Talking," her mother said. "He kept everything until he'd decided it was worth saying. It used to make me want to throw things at him." A pause with something almost warm in it. "You're better at that, even when it's hard." She thought about the evaluation, about 5 days of being told her talk-last habit was a structural problem, about her mother naming it as an inherited one. "I'm working on it," she said. "I know," her mother said. "I can tell." They talked for 20 more minutes about things that had nothing to do with passes or ridgelines or programs. Her mother's garden, which had produced a quantity of tomatoes she was apparently unprepared for, a neighbor's renovation that was making noise at unreasonable hours, the small accumulated texture of a life being lived in a house, in a town where nothing had happened in the last 10 days except ordinary things. Lena listened and felt the particular quality of that, the ordinary things going on, uninterrupted, exactly as they were supposed to be. When they hung up, she sat with the satellite phone in her hands for a moment. Then she set it down and looked at the mountains for the last time that evening, which were doing the thing mountains do in the last light. Every color intensified briefly before the dark, as if the landscape was spending something it had been saving all day. 2 weeks. Then Fort Liberty. Then the program. Then whatever came after that, which she did not know and had decided she was not going to spend the intervening time trying to predict. She had spent 5 years predicting what visibility would cost her, and had been wrong about the specific way the cost would arrive. The briefing room had cost her, not in the way she'd feared, but in a different way that she was still carrying and intended to keep carrying. The pass had cost her the promise and given her something she didn't have a clean word for yet. The platform had cost her certainty and given her confirmation. The program would cost her the last of the invisibility. She thought that was probably the right trade. The rifle case was in her room. The Accuracy International her father had maintained for years and left behind without intending to, which she had carried for 5 years like a kept secret and would now carry differently. Not hidden, not apologized for, not explained as a competitive shooting firearm on a personal property declaration. Just carried. Just what it was. She went inside. The orders came through 41 hours later. She read them once, folded them, put them in the outer pocket of her gear bag. She shook hands with Calloway, who held the handshake a beat longer than protocol required, which she understood as the version of everything he'd tried to say over the last week that he hadn't quite landed. She and Torres stood by the vehicle lot for a few minutes and said the things people say when they're not going to see each other for a long time and don't know how to account for that in the available vocabulary. "Check in," he said. "When you can." "I will." "And if you can't," he stopped. "Then I'll assume you're busy being excellent somewhere nobody can talk about." She looked at him. "That's probably accurate," she said. Yates was at the vehicle when the transport arrived. He had the expression of someone who had been composing something to say and had arrived at the moment of delivery and discovered the composition was inadequate. "Just," he started, stopped. "What you did. All of it." He put his hands in his pockets. "I'm going to be telling that story for the rest of my life." "Get the 30% right," she said. He looked confused. "Torres will explain it," she said. She got in the vehicle. The Firebase receded through the window. The perimeter wire, the observation posts, the northeast ridgeline in the distance that looked like any other ridgeline from this angle, indistinguishable from terrain that hadn't spent 3 weeks watching a firebase below it. Mountains that knew nothing about what had happened in them and kept their own counsel, as mountains do. She faced forward. The road opened up ahead. She had spent 5 years becoming invisible in increments so small she'd barely noticed each one. A pulled group here, a silence there, a choice to maintain the equipment rather than reveal the person who understood more than the equipment required. She had gotten very good at it. She had made herself into someone who occupied space without demanding anything from that space, and she had told herself this was humility or practicality or the honoring of a promise. It had been fear with better justifications. She was not finished being afraid. She suspected she would be afraid for a long time of the specific thing she'd been afraid of being seen and found insufficient, of the cost of visibility, of rooms full of people watching her be what she actually was. But she had been afraid in a pass at altitude and fired anyway. She had been afraid on an observation platform in the dark and fired anyway. She had been afraid in a room with Reyes and Hendricks for 5 days and spoken anyway, while she was still thinking, before she was certain. The fear was part of it. The fear was the 30% that Yates left out of the story, and that Torres had said was the part that meant she was human. She was keeping it. She was keeping all of it. The transport moved through the mountain road with the particular focus of a vehicle covering distance, and Lena Mercer, signals specialist, program candidate, her father's daughter, sat in it and looked forward, and the road was long and the mountains on either side were indifferent and enormous, and somewhere ahead of her was a future she had been hiding from for 5 years that had been patient enough to wait. It would not wait much longer. Neither would she. The strongest thing you will ever do is stop hiding what you are, not when it's safe, not when it's easy, but exactly when it costs you something to be seen.